salt wind had a way of making every word feel smaller. It pressed cold fingers into the brickwork of the gatehouse and hummed in the arrow slits, worrying at iron as a wolf worries bone. Even before the shutters opened, Eddard Stark could taste the sea in the air and feel the old strength of the place in his ribs. Storm's End did not merely stand against the weather. It was the weather, half born from black water and thunder, a keep that had learned to speak like the surf. Patient, relentless, and unwilling to yield. They came ashore between squalls, the boat knocking against the stone steps with the steady rhythm of a drum. Jon held to the gunwale with both hands, his knuckles pale, and stared up at the walls. He had never seen walls like these. Winterfell's were broad and gray and sturdy as a father's hand. These were black when wet, near black even when dry, and every seam was choked with salt. The curtain rose in clean, unadorned lines that made no compromise with the eye. No banners flew atop the drum towers. Stannis Baratheon did not waste cloth in rain, and yet the place announced itself more forcefully than 1,000 tapestries. The waves fell, the waves struck, the walls endured. That was the sigil of Storm's End, more true than any stag. A rider with a torch met them at the base of the stair and spoke just loudly enough for voice to carry over the water. "Lord Stark, the Lord of Storm's End awaits you."
Ned nodded.
He turned to Jon, set a steadying hand to the boy's shoulder, and in that gesture felt both weight and absence. The weight of the choice that had brought them from the gray wolves and cold gods of the north to this southern fastness. The absence of a voice that would never again answer his "Remember me, Ned," and the old blue-scented ache that came with it. He pressed the ache down as he always did, as he had learned to do when the nights were hard and the quiet too filled with memory. Duties were made of iron and men were meant to carry them without staggers. Jon did not look away from the wall. "It's taller," he said, "than the tower at home." "Westermen boast their towers," the rider said as they climbed. "Stormlanders build walls you cannot boast past." Jon's mouth twitched in a private smile that Ned recognized and could not quite interpret, as if the boy tucked away comparisons in a quiet ledger somewhere and would open it later when no one looked. And then they passed under the arch. Within, the world changed. The sea's clamor became a muffled breath. The courtyard stones were slick underfoot, but the rain had lost its teeth. The thickness of the walls was a kind of miracle. Ned did not call it such aloud. Stormlords were superstitious about the old magics that kept the place from cracking under wave and thunder. They called it craft and stubbornness, not miracles, and stewards with flensing knives could make a lamb of a guest who used the wrong word in the wrong company. Stannis Baratheon waited under the overhang of the great hall, hood thrown back, hair plastered to his skull. His mouth at rest was a line drawn in the wrong place, too firm for comfort. When he moved, it was always with the air of a man who had counted the steps in advance and found them necessary if not desirable. "Lord Stark," he said, and offered neither hand nor smile. He did incline his head. For Stannis, that was fealty, greeting, and courtesy combined. "Lord Stannis," Ned replied, "you look as you always have, like a man in rain." He looked down at Jon then, considering without softening. "And this is the boy. This is Jon." Ned's voice gentled around the name despite himself. He felt the flick of Stannis's gaze back to him at that gentling and wondered what ledger the Storm Lord kept that could record such subtleties. "He is 9 years old. He reads, writes, rides reasonably. He is quiet when he must be, spirited when he should not be, and careful in neither regard as often as I would like." Jon bowed as Catelyn had taught the children. He did it well. He always did such things well the first time and grew careless later, as if some hidden part of him resented the tidiness of repetition. "My lord," he said, and his voice was thinner in the damp air than it was in Winterfell's quiet rooms. Stannis nodded to him in something like approval, though the movement might simply have been gravity asserting itself through a stiff neck. "You'll call me my lord. You'll call my steward steward, my master-at-arms sire, and the maester by his name. You'll speak when asked. You'll see to your tasks before you see to your comforts. You will not lie." Jon blinked once, as if the last instruction were an odd weapon to brandish at the door. "No, my lord," he said. "Good." Stannis turned on his heel and led into the hall without waiting to see if they followed. That, too, was courtesy in Stannis's language. Trust that men would follow because they should, not because you jingled them forward with smiles or lures. They removed damp cloaks, Storm's End consumed cloaks, and were ushered by the steward, a lean, precise man named Cale Otmore with a face like a plumb line, to the benches near the nearest fire. The great hall's fires were set deep in iron-banded pits, less for warmth than for the habit of giving men something to fix their eyes upon when wind and drum tower hummed with their own low voices. Servants brought bread, thick-cut salt pork, and a stew with the reliable heaviness of carrots. A cask of cider appeared as if weather had brewed it. The cider surprised Ned, light and brisk with a bitter snap at the end. "My household is smaller than a Lord of Storm's End might keep," Stannis said. He ate as if feeding a furnace, with an attention to speed that did not compromise neatness. "I do not entertain. If you require entertainments, you have sailed to the wrong place." "We require no entertainments," Ned said. His eyes went to Jon, who sat carefully upright and considered how much stew might be too much before a long talk, and the corner of Ned's mouth moved. "He requires work. Work he will have. He'll page for me and for my lady's household when she is here. When he has lengthened into his bones, he'll squire. There is a master-at-arms in the yard you will hear before you see him. He is not a subtle man. I find that useful in certain matters. Ser Harbert Fell," the steward supplied, as though names were a dowel that would keep the conversation firm. "From Mistwood." "Fell is a hammer," Stannis said drily. "The Stormlands teach men to blunt, and some learn to sharpen after." He glanced at Jon. "Do you know why that wall stands?" Jon looked perforce toward the great gray curve that made this hall's near side feel like a cave's mouth. "Because men built it, my lord. Thick, strong." Stannis's mouth did something that might once have been a smile but had since become a grimace at the memory of smiling. "Men built it as thick as 3 horses in harness and wide enough that a cart can turn upon it. Built it more than once. The older stones are lower." He had a way of stating facts dry, sure. "They built it thick and found it wanting, so they built it thicker. They built it hard and found it wanting, so they made it harder. They learned what weather makes of men. The weather here does not care to be defied. The wall was taught by both the building and the erosion. That is how things endure." Jon looked down at his hands in his lap and threaded the fingers together, unthreaded them, threaded them again. He had made a habit of pretending his hands were not there. He said nothing, which was the right answer to a speech with no question. Later, when the bowls were empty and the rain had backed off to a mutter, Maester Cresen came limping from a side door with a measured caution that made one think of fragile glass. His hair had thinned out the way old snow thins, leaving islands of white. His face had the good-worn quality of an oft-read page. He bowed to Ned with a warmth that made something in Ned, something hollowed by long miles, feel less precariously stretched across bow and bone. "My Lord Stark, I am honored," Cresen said. "I recall the drum of your men's boots in this hall the day the siege broke. It was a sound even the walls had waited to hear." "Maester," Ned said, and the old man's name felt like a rest. Cresen lowered himself to the bench with a caution that was long practice rather than complaint. "Storm's End is a hard tutor," he said with a ghost of cheer, "but a fair one for boys who will one day be men. For men who have already chosen to be men, it is perhaps less pleasant." "I have not come for pleasant," Ned said.
"No," Stannis murmured.
"You never did." The talk that followed was quiet, like rain that reaches ground already soaked. They spoke names, stewards and pages, the master of hounds, the woman who oversaw the surplus of woolens, the 2 boys who would share Jon's chores and likely his bed space in the page's chamber. They spoke of the godswood, small, salt-bitten, stubborn, ringed by a low wall intended less to keep things out than to keep the little within, from which the wind had torn the top from the red-leafed sapling 3 winters past and which had nonetheless sprouted anew. They spoke of the work required. The tally book Stannis would have Jon copy, the morning hours devoted to letter, accounting, and law. Stannis believed the last to be a craft to be learned like net mending. The noon hours in the yard where Fell would pry apart the boys' stance and knit it together better, the afternoons of Page's tasks when he would learn how houses run by doing the running. They spoke of what could be expected and what would not be borne. Ned asked very little. He listened. When questions came, he found them in the grain of the offering. How are rudders repaired on this coast? With how many men is the gate shut in weather? Where do the dogs sleep when lightning splits the keep? As if the answers would teach him what the walls themselves had learned. He stored the answers as if clay jars of grain in the crypt where Winterfell kept old kings. He did not speak of the promise that had brought him here as much as the wind had brought him and all his choices with it. A promise had a way of bending both life and doorframe around itself, and it did not soften with time. He tasted blue when he thought of it and forced his jaw not to clench. When the hall had emptied and Cresen left with a word to Jon about lending him a little book full of maritime terms, Ned and Stannis stood together near a back door where the jamb was scarred as though sometime in their boyhood the Baratheons had tried to count strength against it by pressing their backs and legs and measuring the creak. Stannis looked at it as if measuring again. "He will be safe," Ned said. He did not put question into the words. He did not need to. If there was a place in the South built to be safe, it was this one. And if there was a man in the South who would not permit harm he had not weighed and chosen, it was this one. "Safe he will be," Stannis replied. "Soft he will not be. That is not my hope." Stannis's eyes were the color of winter light on a blade. "Your hope," he said, and Ned heard the carefulness a man uses when he makes his mouth say a thing it does not want to say, "is layered. You foster a boy where I learned to be despised by the realm and needed by it. You send him to a place that starved me, that tried to break me so that he can learn how not to break. There are other places a Northman might send a boy." "There are," Ned said. "I did not send him to them. You might have sent him to the Riverlands, to your good brother's seat, to Lannisport if you wished to teach him to smile in gold, to the Vale, to the very mountain you were a boy in. You sent him here. Tell me why." There were answers that were true and some that were not. There were also answers that could not be said aloud even in a room with walls as thick as these and with weather as loud. Ned let the truth he could speak take him in hand like a blade he had held 1,000 times and knew the weight of. "You are a stern man," he said. "Stern men do not teach boys to beg for love. They teach them to hold to duty as to a rope in a storm." "Duty is a rope," Stannis said, with no rejoinder, only a kind of bleak assent. "It burns the hands and leaves them stronger if they do not let go, or leaves them bleeding and less fit to grip when they next must. So, and here a boy is taught not by company and court and easy triumphs but by the feel of rock and the sound of waves. Here there is no flattery strong enough to drown storms. Here there are men who have known hunger." He let that hang. Stannis had known starvation in a way that would never again let him laugh with any freeness. "Here he may grow close to you, closer than in the court, closer than in letters, closer than in 10 feasts." Stannis's jaw made a small motion. "Close for what purpose?" "Closeness is a purpose. It binds the realm. You are Robert's brother. I am the brother who held his seat," Stannis said flatly, and then was given another in exchange. Ned did not answer at once. Rain tasted like iron. The murmurs of servants reached them thinly, like threads of a tapestry that were not part of the main picture. The wind lodged in the chimney and would not be dislodged. "The realm phrase," he said. "Men boast, as your man said, but boasting does not keep weather out. Blood holds where words slip. It is good for a boy of the north to be seen at your right hand in the south." "Seen by whom?" "By those who count such seeing. By lords whose banners answer yours. By men who will say, 'The Starks and the Baratheons bind themselves not by feast but by frost and thunder.' If one day there must be a bond that is more than guests' rights, if one day that is prudent, then a boy raised in your house is better suited than a stranger." Stannis looked out through the notch of the half-open door to where the wall met the rain, considered, turned the thing in his mind as he would turn a case at table. "You speak of prudence. In my house that is flattery," he said at last, near dry. "If you counsel that a rope be plaited, then I will not cut it merely to hear the twang." "That is all I ask," Ned said. Do not ask of me softness. I will not play at father. I will teach. I will try to be fair. He will be treated as any page is. He will be used. That is how boys become men who are useful. That is all I ask, Ned repeated, and felt again the blue ache and swallowed it. He wondered, not for the first time, whether promises ever fully went down when swallowed or whether they lodged under the breastbone forever as seeds that could not decide whether to sprout, and rotted where they lay. The page's chamber was as narrow as a scripture. 3 beds in a line, straw fresh and itching, blankets that smelled faintly of lanolin and the kind of smoke that comes from damp wood. A small chest at the foot of each bed with a simple hasp. A window slit that admitted only noises of the world and a taste of salt. The boys who would be Jon's early companions were introduced. Aaron Penrose, 11, the late Lord's cousin's son, freckled and already believing every man in the world either a friend or an obstacle, and Richard Morrigan, 8 and careful, eyes as quick and gray as dishwater when the ladle shakes it. Aaron eyed Jon's boots, his satchel, the little whittled direwolf that Ned had slipped into the boy's hand at the docks, and grinned like mischief that had already mapped the keep. "North boy," Aaron said, "you'll freeze your ears off in summer and think it pleasant." "I'll think it windy," Jon returned, almost politely. "Penrose," Stannis said without turning his head, "if you teach him to jest in my hall, I will have you explain to him later why laughter rots where work should be." Aaron's grin became the shape grins make when they are folded and put away. "Yes, my lord," he said, still cheerful, as if the world was bound by rules and he merely collected them. Perhaps the Stormlands made cheer an act of defiance. There were tasks to hand out, simple old tasks that were the spine of castles. Jon's first week's worth were listed by the steward in neat script with no flourish. Rise at first bell, attend on the lord with ewer and towel, carry message rolls to the armory, copy 3 pages of the household account, sand and scrape the long table in the lesser hall, bring feed to the hounds, stand by in the yard with extra poles and practice blades. It was staggering only if one thought about it all at once. Ned thought about none of it. He learned long ago that it was better to think about the next thing and then the next. He stayed 2 days, long enough to see that Jon learned the names once and would learn them again. Long enough to stand in the godswood and put his hand on the salt-bent sapling and feel the odd quiet joy that the old gods could take root anywhere a man permitted them a patch of earth and time. Long enough to watch Ser Harbert fell crack a practice blade across a post and hear the post's complaint ring in the ribs and for the master-at-arms to tell Jon, "You stand like the wind could pull you by the ears. Stand like you're the post and let wind come and go." Long enough to know that leaving would be harder than he wanted it to be and that difficulty meant he had chosen something not his own comfort. On the second night, Davos Seaworth came in out of rain with a cask in the back of a cart and the kind of grin that made rooms warmer. "My lord," he said to Stannis, "I bring you 20 good tubs of salt cod, a mother's worth of onions that could make a kitchen weep for joy, and a new story about a man who swore he could drink the bay." "You will not tell the story," Stannis said. "I will not, my lord," Davos said cheerfully, and then, with a glance at Ned that held recognition, "Northern lord, honor about him like a cloak you could not see and yet felt the draft in." He bowed, and the bow was neat and unembarrassed. "Ser Davos," he said to Ned, "at your service."
"Lord Stark," Ned replied.
"Your service has been in this place longer than mine." "Not so long as his," Davos said with a chin at Stannis. "The lord here held the walls with his teeth when food was as rare here as courtesy at a Sellsword camp. I brought him onions once. He brought me a better name than smuggler, and let me keep the old one besides. A fair trade. Fairer to you than to the law," Stannis said tartly. "The law cannot go hungry," Davos replied, unfazed. "Men can," and then, with a look to Jon that was curious without prying. "And who is this straight back, my lord? New page? He stands like he's learning to stand. Everyone does at first." "My ward," Ned said, the word chosen and swallowed both. "Jon." "Ser," Jon offered. "Just Davos will do in a kitchen," Davos said. His hands were scarred, which told true things about the world and the work of it. "You'll learn to peel onions without crying. They say it isn't possible. I say you must keep your blade clean and your mind elsewhere." "Elsewhere," John asked, caught, perhaps, by the notion that work required such small tricks as well as back and will. Davos said. The sea, maybe. Think of how it sounds when it means to be gentle. Ken, sometimes. John looked toward the wall and the slit that let through a thin thread of the outside, and it seemed to Ned that the boy was measuring the sound right then, weighing what gentleness might sound like in a place that had taught itself to outlast storms. Ned watched them, watched his boy take in the shape of this new life and the men who would shape him, and it like watching a craftsman lay the first still wet stones of a foundation that would hold a house no man had quite drawn yet. He found himself wanting to say 10 things, 20, 100. Remembered that boys hear none of them, and said only, "Be as honest as is safe," in a low voice when they walked the little godswood before dawn. John looked at him with that careful ledgered look he had and nodded once. It was at once acceptance and promise and a question. Honest about what? Ned could not shape the answer without cutting flesh. About yourself, he added, and that was true even when it was not the whole truth. He knelt, set a hand to the damp earth despite the chill, and the smell of it rose like a song from the north. He spoke to the old gods without words, and then he spoke to his boy. "You will think I leave you," he said. John, who carried the kind of pride that wanted to be asked nothing and needed to be asked much, said, "I will think you do as you must." Ned's mouth twisted. "I will come when I can. Write to me of what you learn, not of how you feel about it." John's mouth twitched to match his. "Would you read the latter?" "Yes," Ned admitted. "But it would not help you as much as telling me how Fell changed your stance or which column of figures did not add because a steward rounded up casks when he should have counted the loss to leakage. You think numbers are more honest than feelings," John said, not as a rebuke, but as a testing of the wall to see where it could be pushed. "I think they are more useful when you must move men and grain and make both meet winter," Ned said. "Feelings do not keep a bridge sound when the river runs high. Knowing where you have laid the stones does." John nodded. Salt lay on his hair as if the sea had tried to claim him early. "Yes, father." Ned rose. The word touched him as it always did, the way a hand touches an old scar. He put his palm to the back of John's head and felt the warm skull there and wanted to say, "I did not steal you from your truth. I built you a house under a storm and hope it will outlast the weather that brought you into this world." Instead he said, "Obey Lord Stannis as you would me." John breathed out slowly. "He is not much like you." "No," Ned said. "He is like himself." When the dawn came up like a pewter dish, Ned took leave in the hall and found it harder than he had planned. Stannis stood stiff as a pole driven into grit. "He will be a page," he said, as if repeating it made it so in a way that was useful. "He will be a squire. If he is not a fool, he will be a man." "I ask no more," Ned said. Stannis resisted and then gave in to an impulse so small it would have gone unnoticed in any other man. He laid a hand on John's shoulder, a practical, assessing thing, like a carpenter seeing if the wood was good, and squeezed once. "You will not flatter me," he said. "You will not presume you understand my wishes if I do not state them. You will not lie." John nodded. "If you fail at any of these," Stannis added, "it will not be the end of the world, but I will triple your work. I am not the world. I am practice for it." That, unexpectedly, made Aaron Penrose grin at John as if to say, "See? He speaks like that always. It means he cares in the way knives care about bread." Ned left through the gate where the rider had met them. He did not look back. Looking back would have sharpened a grief that served no one. He stepped onto the boat and let the wind take him out with practiced indifference. The second squall came across the bay like a cat that had decided to pretend it wasn't stalking. When it struck all at once. Ned bowed his head and did not think of blue, of bed, of rose. He thought of walls and rope and boys who stood like posts. He thought of bonds that were not feasts. John's hours filled as quickly as buckets in rain. There was a comfort in the bluntness of work at Storm's End. It did not ask a boy if he liked it. It asked if he would do it. He became a pair of hands carrying a damp towel, a back bending to fetch a dropped scroll and carry it, a set of eyes copying numbers from one neat column to another and recognizing the moment a digit went astray like a sheep fleeing a herd. He learned that cider is counted in barrels and quarters, that the household used more pitch than he would have guessed, that linen needs air even when it is not wet, that dogs have politics as intricate as court and will not forgive a boy who forgets to greet the rangy ringleader each morning. In the mornings when Stannis had him copy from the tally book, Jon learned that his hand cramped first and then stopped cramping. He learned the word for a cargo that arrived short of the tally and the one for a pilot who lied about shoals. He learned that Stannis would circle a mis-copied figure with a small, neat circle that looked like an eye and say nothing, and that the silence was heavier than any raised voice. He learned to count louder in his head than his pride in being quick. He learned to be slower and write as a way to stop the circles, and when the circles stopped, the empty page felt like a full plate. Stannis spoke little while they worked, but his little taught much. "A lord who cannot count will be counted out," he said once, and Jon stored that with care. "Men will forgive a lord who does not laugh," he said, almost absent. "They will not forgive a lord who forgets to pay them on time," he said. "If you cannot hold your anger through one breath, you cannot hold a gate through one storm," he said. "You will be lied to. Learn where truth hides in lies. That is a more honest game than pretending men do not lie." In the yard, Fell treated boys like posts until they learned to be posts and then like ladders when they were ready to climb. He struck the flat of Jon's blade with his own until Jon's wrist sang and would have dropped the sword if not for a stubbornness that surprised even Jon. "You think too quick," Fell barked. "Thinking is good when you're not in a fight. In a fight, you already did your thinking or you die doing it." He showed Jon how to set his feet so that wind could not pull him by the ears, how to find the flat space between one breath and another, how to see just before a strike rather than after. "There," he said when Jon finally managed not to flinch when the practice blade came like a thunderclap. "There, you held like a wall. Now move like a man and not a wall." Afternoons brought the running of messages, the lugging of wood, the careful cleaning of candelabra, the fetching of hot stones to the ladies' chambers when the damp got into their bones. Lady Celis was not always at Storm's End. Her kin held seats in the Reach, and there were matters of cousinage and duty that carried her off for a month at a time. But when she was in residence, the pages stood straighter. She did not speak as much as she judged, though her judgments were not voiced. That could be worse. Jon learned to make himself invisible to her gaze, not from fear, but because her eyes made him feel like an ash on which a woman might decide to set a ring or not. He preferred the honest blows of the yard. Renley came and went in those first months like sunlight between rain. He had the knack of appearing in a group of boys without making them feel that they had been gathered for his benefit, and yet leaving with the sense that something more lively had passed through them. He taunted Stannis without malice and was chastised without malice in return. He taught Jon which corners the house cats liked best and how to rub behind their ears without earning a bloodied finger. He held a practice blade in the yard with a casual grace that made Fell purse his lips and bark twice as much. He laughed, and Jon discovered he did not resent the laughing. He resented that it lived so easily in Renly's throat and not in his own. "You stand like Stannis," Renly said to Jon after a morning in which Fell declared the lot of them as stubborn as sheep who'd learned about cliffs. "That is a compliment in the yard and a warning at table." "How do I stand at table, then?" Jon asked, suspicious that the answer would be to stand like Renly. "Like a man who knows where the bread lies and does not apologize for it," Renly said, surprising him. Maester Cresen took Jon into the library on the third week to return the maritime terms and replace them with something fatter. "You must learn our genealogies," he said, with the gravity of a man offering rope. "Not simply names and dates. Lineages are the cords that have bound this cup to that table for centuries. If you pull here, which knot comes loose there? Who resents whom for an old slight you cannot read in a tally? Which petty lord in the marches still thinks he was wronged because a storm king in a story married a woman he wanted? It is silly, yes. Silly things kill men at court. We mitigate their silliness by knowing it." Jon found that he liked Cresen's room. It also smelled of the sea, but it was a different sea than the one that threw itself at the walls. This one was a sea of vellum and glue, a sea of dry reeds and curling inks, and old leather that had kept its oils well. The maester's talk was gentle but not soft. He asked questions that made Jon feel foolish and then made the feeling useful. "You are not a fool because you do not know a thing," Cresen said. "You are a fool because you do not wish to know it, or because you pretend that you know it and do not." He sang the old songs of the Stormlands under his breath as he sorted. Of Durin who built and built again, of Elenii whose love was a wind's face for some and an oath for others, of Orys Baratheon and a sword with a lion's bite taken out. He told Jon where the old gods had once stood in a grove south of the keep and how the roots there had gone to salt and died, and of why the little godswood had been planted. Not to store superstition, but to give men a place to think with their hands in something that had not been carved by men. Of nights, Jon slept in a bed that was not his own, warmed by his own breath and the closeness of other sleeping boys, and dreamed not of wolves but of waves. He dreamed the waves were hands that could not decide whether to catch or undo, and he woke sometimes with the sense that if he listened hard enough, the wall would tell him which it meant to be. When he grew lonely, he stood in the godswood where the ground was perpetually damp, and touched the stunted weirwood with its new growth like thin blood. He did not pray with words. He did not trust words. He stood and the gods heard a boy standing, and that was prayer enough. Letters went north. They were neat, as Stannis preferred, and precise, as Cresen encouraged. He wrote of the yard, of Fell's disdain for thinking during blows, of the method by which a scribe's knife could rescue a page without ruining the whole, of the taste of cider when the wind had been particularly sharp. He did not write of his feelings. He did not have the words for them and had been told not to use them even if he did. He trusted that his father would read the curve of his letters and the numbers that were correct and know how the boy behind them held himself. Ravens came and ravens went. A letter from the king arrived once, and Jon imagined how Stannis carried the weight of the seal more than the words within. Stannis broke it open with a finger and read it at table without changing his face. Later, to Cresen in a tone of reluctant intimacy, he said, "He writes as if letters are hunts. He runs, then reports. He does not write to ask. He writes to declare." There was no bitterness in it, only accounting as men count casks. The first great storm of the year came in the 4th month after Jon's arrival. Cale Otmore announced it with the same voice he used to announce visitors. A courtesy, a warning. The sky darkened in increments so neat they might have been scribes' marks. The wind found its bearings and then came steady, then harder. The walls began to hum as though the stones remembered chords. Men moved heavier without hurrying. Doors were barred not to keep men out, but to keep them from being snatched through as if they were paper. The sea rose. Jon stood on the parapet beside Stannis, wrapped in a cloak that smelled of pitch and wool, and learned the art of watching storms with a man who believed storms to be arguments that could be won by outlasting them. Stannis always stood a step back from the crenellations so that wind did not tear at his cheeks. He planted both feet. He put his hands behind his back so the impulse to grab and hold something did not make him look unsteady. He looked not at the waves themselves, there were always waves, but at the places where their lines broke and changed. "There," he said. "Then there." Jon learned to see what he meant. This wave less dark than that one and therefore less deep, this spray fine and therefore flung farther and likely to slip under the visor, this break a little higher and therefore the wind's true direction is already shifting. A man who watches only the biggest thing in front of him is surprised by the smaller ones that move it, Stannis said, and the advice came in handy 2 days later when Fell fainted to Jon's right and brought the practice blade up from the left, and Jon did not fall for it because he had learned to watch the shoulder that changed the strike. After the storm spent itself, the air felt scrubbed. Men eased. In kitchens, onion and pork tasted better when the air had been scoured, as if someone had taken the dust out of hunger as one takes it out of a rug. Jon slept, and his dreams were not of hands but of weight, of how a stone feels when it is fit into other stones and the builder's palm leaves and the seam hums. He woke early to the sound of Cresen coughing in rooms that smelled of apple and chalk. He carried the maester a cup of water without spilling. He learned that kindness has no place on the tally sheet and still earns some credit. There were moments, kneeling to tie Richard's laces when the boy fumbled, walking behind Renley, who smelled of soap that never seemed to forget the reach, laughing once to his own surprise when Davos described a fishmonger's cat in Shipbreaker Bay hissing at a crab and the crab lifting its claws in priestly disdain. That belonged not to Storm's End the fortress but to Storm's End the house. In those moments, the stones seemed less a wall against the world than a spine along which lives ran. Jon began to think of that spine as something he could grow upon, not merely lean against. He rode again. He counted more right than wrong. He learned to hold his blade so that his wrists did not suffer for his shoulders' confidence. He learned that Stannis could be fair in ways men underestimated because the fairness came with no embroidery. When a groom lied about a missing rug and a maid took the blame, Stannis listened to them both as if they were captains, then set them both to extra duty with the equal severity of a scale that knows gravity. "If I err," he said to Cresen later where Jon could hear, "let me err in believing that men can be corrected by work. If a man cannot be corrected by work, then work will nevertheless be done." There were old stories at Storm's End about Durin God's grief and the wind that hated him for the love he took. Jon learned to hear them without swallowing them, to honor the part of the story that was not a lie. That men build and storms unbuild and men build again, and it is not the love in the story that keeps the walls, it is the work. He learned to stand in the godswood and listen to the sea and the leaves at once, and to understand with a boy's understanding that the gods would not come out of the tree to speak to him because the gods had done their speaking already with seed and storm and survival, and now it was his work to do. And yet, for all that, there were still nights when he turned on his pallet and looked toward the slit window where salt washed its cold breath across the stones, and he remembered with his hands the shape of Winterfell. The deep quiet of the crypts, the way steam rose from the hot springs like a great beast breathing, the smell of the kennels, Robb's laughter in a corridor, Sansa's careful way of putting ribbons into tidy places, Arya's bare feet slapping stone. He remembered the feel of his father's coat when he ran his fingers along the seams as a younger boy, wondering how the stitch held so neatly. He remembered Catelyn's eyes and the way they slid off him like rain off a seal's back, neither blessing nor curse, merely the weather of a woman's heart. He had not hated her for it. He did not know what to do with it. Once, late, he found Stannis in the godswood. It was odd, seeing the man there among trees. He looked like a tower someone had moved by mistake into a copse. He stood with his hands behind his back and his mouth in that severe line, looking at the stunted weirwood as if it had made a claim on him he did not remember agreeing to. He glanced at Jon, acknowledged him without words, and returned to the tree. "It is not like your northern godswoods," he said after a time, when it would not seem that he had come to the place for talk. "It is a small thing. It remembers what salt does to growth." "It remembers to grow anyway," Jon said. "Yes," Stannis nodded once. "It displeases me less than a sept would." He glanced sidelong. "You look to it as if it owes you something." "It owes me nothing," Jon said quickly. "Good." Stannis studied the thin leaves. "Do not make gods into creditors. They are not good at keeping ledgers that men can read. We keep the ledgers. The gods are weather." He could say such things because he would never kneel to an altar and ask for a coin of mercy he could not bear to owe. Jon wondered what sort of man that made him. Not wise like Cresen, not kind like Davos, not bright like Renley, but sure in the way a spear set correctly is sure. "You will squire one day," Stannis said, as if continuing a thought Jon had not heard. "Constancy and obedience will make you useful. That is not a small thing. Men think it is small because it makes them feel small. They are wrong." "Yes, my lord. If you were mine," Stannis said. "If, the smallest and heaviest word in that sentence. I would have you study more law than sword. Fell can teach 1,000 boys to swing a sword. I can teach a handful to know what to cut. If you were mine," he said again, and let the air hold the other half of that thought. Jon shifted, uncertainty and fidelity wearing at each other like stones in a tide. "I am my father's," he said, and the words were true in more than one way and less in another. Stannis said. "A boy is many men's. The trick is to learn to be your own as well." He looked at the weirwood, its new growth trembling. "Go sleep. Storms teach patience to those who cannot outlast them." Jon slept. In his dream, he was upon a wall of stone that hummed with old songs, and a gate in the wall opened onto a bay filled not with boats but with ledgers, each page a sail, each figure a wave. He walked down to the water and did not wet his feet. He woke with the certainty that he had forgotten something important, and that the forgetting was not a loss but a discipline, like holding a blade tighter at a true moment. When winter rode the sea south on the backs of iron-colored clouds, a raven came from the north with a piece of Winterfell's quiet wrapped around its leg. Ned Stark's hand was the same as it ever was, neat, uncompromising, with a weight in the diagonal of the letters that felt like an axe's fall. He asked Jon whether salt cod substituted well in a stew when the beef was low. He asked how many casks of cider were presently sound in the Storm's End cellars, and how the steward marked those that were beginning to turn. He told his son that Bran had taken to climbing where he should not, and that Robb had learned to listen better, not because he wanted to but because men relied on him and he wanted to be worthy of their reliance. He told Jon that the gods would had slid its first sheet of winter ice into a silver grin, and that Maester Luwin had said something complicated about stars that was meant to be comforting and had been so because it was complicated, and men who think about complicated things lighten the load for men who do the lifting. He did not tell Jon he missed him. He did not have to. Jon answered with numbers and stories. He told how Fell had forced him to swing a practice blade until it felt like he was holding back a river with his wrists, and then had praised him by calling him a nuisance for no longer letting the weapon wag him. He told how Cresen had laughed when he had asked whether a certain Storm King had truly driven a sword into a gust of wind and been answered, "In story, that is what men do when they cannot drive a sword into themselves without troubling the audience." He told how Davos had taught him to slice an onion with his mind elsewhere, and how he had chosen to think of the sea when it wanted to be gentle and had discovered that the sea sometimes wanted that. He told of Stannis' circles on pages and how a day without a circle felt like a small feast. He told his father that storms teach without caring whether a boy wishes to be taught, and that he was learning to be unastonished by work. He did not tell his father he missed him. He did not have to. A year turned like a wheel. Boys lengthen in odd ways, first in arm, then in shin, then in rib. Their voices crack in places that are ungainly and then find lower places to stand. Jon grew into his wrists. He broke 3 quills learning to be less fierce with his hand when copying numbers, and then broke none. He took hurts in the yard and learned which to ignore and which to tend and which to let teach him. He got hungry and fed himself and others, and learned the strange joy of feeding another boy a heel of bread you did not think you could spare and discovering that you could. He learned that Renley would always find the joke if it lay within reach, and that Stannis would let it pass if it did no harm to the fabric of the house and would cut it if it did. He learned that Cresen's cough deepened in the damp, and that a boy could divide hours and carry some for an old man without shame. Once, when snow fell in Storm's End, a rare, light thing that made the servants stare upward as if the gods had decided to sieve flour upon them, Jon stood in the yard and let the flakes melt on his tongue. Renley laughed and stuck out his own tongue. Aaron shouted that if it snowed again he would swear fealty to the north, and Richard quietly caught flakes on his sleeve and studied the melting patterns as if he could learn some secret of counting from the way water turned back to itself. Stannis stepped into the yard, glanced at the sky, and said only, "It will not stick," which was true, but did not keep boys from making very small snowballs and declaring them great. Ned came once more before 2 winters had set their teeth. He came with the same quiet that he carried everywhere, which always seemed to take up more room than noise somehow. He stood by the wall with Stannis and looked out at Shipbreaker Bay as if a man could read the future in the lines the waves wrote and rewrote. He spoke to Jon in the Godswood and put his hand on his son's head and said, "You have grown into your wrists," and then, unexpectedly, added, "Your shoulders will come next." Jon wanted 100 things then. To tell him that he had learned to count as the Storm Lord counted, to ask if that made him less a wolf, to ask what work the North asked of shoulders that were a boy's and not yet a man's, to lay his head against his father's breast like a boy younger than he was. He did none of those. He said, "Ser Fell says so too," and felt that he had said enough if not all. "Stannis thinks well of you," Ned said, and Jon could not tell whether the tidiness of the statement made it lighter or heavier. "I do not know for certain," Jon said. "He does not say." "No," Ned said, and his mouth made the shape of a smile without letting it leak. He does not say. He does. It was later, when Ned had gone again, when the walls had taken back what room his quiet had left, that Cresen told John something he had not considered he needed to know. They were in the library, and the Maester was binding a little book about the fiefs along the coast with thread that showed red like blood until he covered it. The old man paused with his needle and said, "Do you know how houses are bound when blood and banner do not suffice?" "With marriage," John said, because even a boy who had not yet begun to truly think of girls knew what houses did. "That is one way," Cresen said gently. "There are others. A man may take another as ward and make him near a son by law if not by blood, though the law is cautious there. A king may legitimize. A lord may name an heir and, with a king's consent, cause a man not of his body to inherit where a brother might have done. The law is a cat with many paths. All of them are small and must be taken carefully, but they exist." John felt the words like an oar dipped into water. A small stroke, yet the boat moved. "Why do you tell me this?" "Because knowledge is a lantern one lights before dark," Cresen said, "and because I am old enough to believe that lanterns should be lit whether or not the man who carries them knows yet where he will walk." He looked at John with that kindness that did not make a boy feel small. "Do not count yourself out of any arithmetic because it seems too complicated. Let the numbers show you where they go." He thought a long time about that arithmetic. He thought about ropes and walls and waves and ledgers. He thought about a kindness that did not have to be owed and a sternness that did not apologize and a northern quiet that could make a room feel like a place where men knew their names. He thought about how men bound houses and how houses required binding most in weather such as this, in weathers to come. He thought, and he did not write any of this to Ned. He wrote that the cider in one cask had begun to turn, and that he had marked it as Cale had taught him, and that he had spoken to the kitchen about pickling onions with it before it soured to waste. It was in this manner, with small work and quiet arithmetic, that a notion as fine as spider silk began to draw itself between wall and north wind. No one spoke it. No one named it aloud. It did not require naming. It became part of the way men stood at table and in yard. A boy with a northern face and a steady hand and a stubborn spine stood at the Storm Lord's shoulder more often than not that summer, and when he did not, he stood at the edge of the yard with a practiced blade and did not flinch at the clap of wood on wood. If he was not a son, still he was a boy men watched. If he was not a Baratheon, still the steward had written his name in the household accounts column that belonged to those of the inner house and not those who came and went. On a day when the sea breathed like an old dog that has finally decided to sleep, Stannis had John carry the tally book down to the storeroom and count by tens aloud while barrels were rolled past. "Not with your mouth alone," Stannis said, voice clipped even when it instructed. "With your eyes. If your eyes are wrong, your mouth being right is no use." John counted. He counted and learned where seeing and saying were the same and where they weren't, and he discovered that the usefulness of numbers in work was not lessened by the fact that they did not warm a boy at night. There were moments when John imagined the rope Cresen had spoken of, the one that could be plaited from strands of law and consent and bond, and he imagined it stretching from the hall at Winterfell to the hall at Storm's End. He did not imagine it as a rope to bind his hands. He imagined it as a thing to hold when the weather turned. In those moments, the world made a little more sense. In those moments, the storm seemed less like a thing that hated and more like a thing that did not care and could therefore be lived through. He did not know then, no one did, what faces the storms in the years to come would choose to wear, whether boars or crowns or iron chairs or white shadows. He knew only how to set his feet and when to hold his breath and when to let it go and how to keep his blade from wagging him and how to count and how to watch a man who did not smile and learn from him without needing his smile to do it. He knew how to stand in a God's wood big as a hand, in a keep big as a legend, and feel the two talk across him like wind speaking to leaf. He knew, finally, that the boy who had come to Storm's End holding a father's hand had begun to shape a grip of his own. On the last day of that first year, when the sea was mild and the memory of winter lay only as a taste on the morning bread, Davos brought a small present to the page's chamber, an onion carved from bone by a sailor who'd lost his pinky to a foolish bet. It was smooth and white and clever, each layer suggested in the next. For you, he told Jon. To remember that a man can be given a thing when times are lean and make more of it than he was owed. Jon turned it in his hand. The layers caught light. He thought about hunger and law and the way men can be fair and stern and kind all at once, and how none of those excused a man from counting correctly. Thank you, he said, and he set the onion on the small chest at the foot of his bed among the 2 other treasures he kept. The little dire wolf his father had whittled, and a circle Stannis had drawn upon a page where Jon, at last, had drawn none. At dawn the next morning, he again rose with the bell, and the air smelled as if a new storm had gone out of its way to be late. He carried the ewer to Stannis with both hands. He did not spill. The wall hummed its old song. Somewhere, a rope was being plaited, and he did not need to see it to know it was there. He lived, as boys do, by doing the next thing well. He did not fear the feeling that a man's life was larger than the day. He could feel its shape the way one feels a wave gather itself. The pull, the crest, the moment of being lifted not by one's own strength but by a force one had learned to read. In that moment, the boy who would one day stand taller than he did now breathed in salt and stone, exhaled quiet, and carried water to the sternest man in the south with hands that had begun to look like a man's. At first light, the wind lay like a sleeping hound in the courtyard, its breath moving the flags in half-thoughts. Jon carried the ewer in both hands. The metal kissed his skin with that small, mean cold that made you concentrate without thinking about concentrating. The door to Stannis' chamber had a habit of not complaining if opened at the same speed each morning. Jon had learned that speed the way he'd learned Fell's first 3 strikes, by letting failure teach his wrists. He moved through the little antechamber with its neatly folded maps and the table with 3 inkpots set like stones across a river, and set the ewer down precisely, as if the wood could feel imprecision and take offense. Stannis took the water as if water had been a thing men earned. Cale says the fishmonger's book is wrong by 3, Stannis said, not looking away from the paper he had been reading since before the bell. He thinks the man rounds himself forward and his gods will smooth the deficit. His gods do not keep ledgers we can read, Jon said. He had not meant to say it exactly so, but it was out, true and unadorned. Stannis' mouth tilted, not up or down, but toward purpose. No, they do not. Bring me the man's last 5 tallies. We will see if he expects mercy when he counts. Jon brought the rolls, and untying thongs felt like untying a small knot in a larger rope. They worked in the way Stannis worked with boys, with silence heavy enough to teach and talk sparse enough to feed. The columns began to line up like soldiers who had discovered their captain was watching. The 3 that were missing were not all missing in the same way, which would have made a prettier lie. One was a cask overcounted in the fisherman's favor, another a weight declared at high tide that turned low in the cellar, the third a barrel that should have been marked as quarterful picked up whole in the book as if men could drink out of a word. Stannis lifted his quill as if it were a blade he did not intend to waste. "Fetch Davos," he said. Davos arrived smelling of salt and the kind of wood you build with rather than burn. He nodded to Jon as if to say, "You belong where men speak of the house's bones." Stannis put the rolls between them like a case laid on a bench. "You'll tell me if I see ghosts," Stannis said. "I'll tell you if you see spirits," Davos replied, amused by his own line even if no one else would be, and bent. His brow furrowed at the second tally, as if the numbers had committed a minor discourtesy by sitting near each other in the order they had chosen. "High tide weight on a fat morning," he said. "Men swear by it when the sun is in their eyes. Barrel is thirsty by the time it rests in the cellar. If you set the mark by the pier, you always make a better man of yourself than you are. Never set the mark by the pier if you can set it where the drinking is done." Stannis's quill scratched a neat circle. "We move the mark. We inform the man. We fine him not for theft but for optimism. Optimists are more dangerous than liars." Davos inclined his head as if that had been a jest and also not a jest. Jon stood just behind Stannis' shoulder and enjoyed the unadorned rightness of a mark made in the correct place, as if the house had shifted its weight to a better foot and discovered it had been limping without knowing it. In the yard the same morning, Fell broke 3 boys and built them again with nothing but his hands and a bark. The old soldier's voice was a kind of weather that did not easily permit flowers, but did not crush them when they came up in spite of it. Jon took his place and braced. Fell came at him from the left with a lazy strike that had fooled him once. Jon watched the shoulder this time, not the blade, and the shoulder told truth in the half-breath before iron. He caught it, met it, let the jar ride his elbows rather than his wrists. Fell grunted. If he had been a different man, he would have smiled. Instead, he stepped back, narrowed his eyes, and said, "Again." As if a boy who does right once were a story you do not trust until you have heard it twice. Renley watched from the low wall with an apple in his hand, flicking the skin onto the dirt with his thumb in long ribbons. "Even a storm has mercy every 30 seconds, it seems," he said to no one in particular. "Every 30 seconds a man who assumed mercy loses his teeth," Fell replied without heat. "Which is why your smile is so fine," Renley returned, and ducked the practice blade that whistled by his ear with a laugh bright enough that even Stannis's window might have heard it. After the yard and after the ink, there were afternoons that smelled of beeswax and old vellum. Maester Cresen's room had 3 lamps that had been polished so often the brass had the contented look of a cat that has decided to allow petting. The Maester's cough sat in the corner and cackled at inconvenient moments. He soothed it with warm water and the habit of ignoring it. He put a volume on the table between himself and Jon that had been rebound twice with cloth that had once been blue. "Lines," he said, tapping the page. "Lines that run like rivers. You may drink from them if you know where to kneel. If you do not, you drown. Where does House Morrigan meet House Wild?" "In marriage twice," Jon said, tracing with a finger. 3 generations and 6. "And what does that mean for a shipwreck near Rainhouse if the cargo belonged to a man sworn to the Morrigans and the crew to Wild? That they should be compelled to argue in front of a third," Jon said, and heard Stannis's voice inside the answer. "Law is a craft one learns, not a god one flatters. That they have argued before," he added when Cresen lifted an eyebrow. "The margin notes say as much." Cresen smiled. It creased his face into a map of pleasure. "Good. Margin notes are the whispers of the dead. When you listen to them, you keep them from becoming ghosts that trouble the living." Cresen's little song of the Stormland's history ran under their lessons like a brook under moss. He hummed it while he marked, faint, a treble that made the numbers sit better because they had a tune to lean upon. Jon liked that the old man made no attempt to turn the world into something kinder than it was. He taught kindness as a habit that made the hard bits bearable, not as a spell that transformed them. The sea kept its own counsel. For a month it lay in a mood of sullen truce, and Stannis had the masons take advantage of the peace to set fresh pitch in cracks where the wind had found purchase. Jon carried buckets and swore at their weight in his head but not aloud. On the 3rd day of the work, a young mason from the marches slipped 3 fingers from a narrow ledge and lost his nerve. His foot skated on wet stone. Jon was on the parapet above with another bucket and the coin of attention that comes from doing something repeatedly without letting boredom steal your eyes. He put his bucket down and flattened himself to stone and reached without letting his stomach do what stomachs wanted to do 3 stories above a courtyard. "I have you," he said to the boy in a voice that did not betray his ribs. "Now you have me. Move your foot to where you were told, not where it wants to go." The boy panted once like a rabbit. He put his foot where he had been taught as if the word had weight. Jon's fingers burned. The boy gained a hand's worth of ledge and then another, and then his shoulder bumped stone hard enough to bruise, and he laughed once as if he had just laughed at death and discovered the man had no sense of humor. Stannis came to the parapet as they were finishing and looked at Jon's raw knuckles with the assessing look he gave new oars. "Good," he said. "It is not heroic to save a man. It is merely correct." Jon did not know what to do with the warmth that sentence spilled in his chest, so he put it away with the onion and the wolf and the circle. Lady Sellis returned in a spray of new-washed wool and a scent like a reach meadow that did not wish to apologize for being in a stone keep. Her chin had the line that men in the Stormlands recognized halfway across a hall and braced for. She did not look at the godswood when she passed the door that led there. If she had, it would have been with the same expression with which she regarded mud on a stair. She made the sept bell ring more often in the weeks she was present, and the kitchen sent more fresh bread up the women's staircase because she believed, rightly, that bread soothed women better than sermons and that bread could be counted. "Pages," she said on a morning of damp and sewing, where a half-dozen ladies sat with hands that moved without the distraction of thought. "You will keep your hands clean among ladies. A lady who must tell you not to paw at her thread is a lady who will tell her lord you do not know where to put your hands." Aaron Penrose blushed. Richard's eyes went to John and away again with some plea for rescue that John could not answer. John kept his hands behind him and did not mistake not fidgeting for virtue. Celis was not unkind, merely precise and watchful, and convinced that those who did not share her precision owed her an apology. When she spoke to Stannis, the room felt as if a steward had come in with a new list, and the house would have to hold its breath for 20 seconds before it could decide whether to sigh or not. She was present at table when the letter from the king came with a seal that had been dug at with a careless knife somewhere in its travel. Stannis cracked it with a nail and read, and his mouth made the shapes it made when reading his brother's talk of hunts and wine and the delight of the morning's light on a woman's hair. He put the letter down with care, as if care were the only soft thing allowed to touch Robert's words in this hall, and said to his lady, "He wishes us to send a hunter he heard praised by Wild last summer. He says he wants to see how a boar fares when a man from Storm's End tracks him, and not an oaf from the Kingswood." "Send the hunter," Celis said, "and send Winifred to the September. She has sewn an off-stitch 3 times. Renley quoted the letter as if it were a jest told with his own mouth and then told another on top of it. Stannis allowed him the first and cut the second with a look. John listened to the words and heard the weight under them. A king who thought Storm's End a place where boars learned to be wary. That would not anger Stannis. It would harden him. It would have been 3 mornings later, had the house not been counting carefully, that Cresen asked John to carry a wrapped bundle from the library to the women's staircase. "Take this to the lady," he said. "She will pretend she does not need it and then use it all the same." "What is it?" John asked, because he did not mind being made to carry things he did not understand, but he disliked not understanding things he carried. "Herbs for nausea," Cresen said, "and something for sleep. What she carries may be a child, and we will pretend it is certainly so until it certainly is not." John had not known what to do with that knowledge. He took it up the stairs and passed it to Celis' maid without looking at the lady's face, because to do so would have been to pry by accident. He went down the stair and felt a ripple pass through the house, as if the old stones themselves had considered the notion of a child and arranged themselves a little differently because of it. He had not mentioned it to Stannis, not because it was a secret. Storm's End kept secrets the way the sea kept jewels. Accidentally, and usually only until a bigger wave came. But because he felt in his bones that the knowing must travel down the proper channels. He wrote to Ned with neat letters that said nothing of it and everything of it. If a man wanted to read between the lines like a maester reading the margin notes of dead stewards. He wrote of new bread at table, of the sept bell, of an order that felt like a list being added to rather than merely recited. He did not write, "I think there may be a child here, and if there is, I do not know if that undoes or completes something you and Stannis intend." He thought it in the gods would, and the weirwood with its salt-torn crown listened without the impoliteness of commenting. There was no announcement until there was, and when it came with Stannis standing at the head of the table and saying, almost grudgingly, "My lady is with child." As if he were ceding to the house a truth the house had sat on for a month and a half. There was bread and cider and a kind of brightness in the hall that had nothing to do with candles. Renley made a loud, ridiculous toast about nieces and nephews and how their cheeks should be pinched properly. Celis suffered his show with the rigid grace of a woman who knows a man is laying a carpet that does not match the room and will be removed after guests have left. Davos's grin that night carried years on it. He clapped John on the shoulder in the small passage near the pantry and said, "A house breathes better when it knows it will have to keep breathing." John did not say what his breath was doing. He did not have a word that did not feel like it would crack if he spoke it. Pregnancies made men gentle in the oddest ways. Fell checked the practice blades for splinters every morning in a way he hadn't before, as if splinters might find women by scent. Stannis walked the parapet twice a day and then again at night, as if he had promised something to the wall he wanted to make sure it knew. Cresen prepared little meals that could be taken without appetite. Celis took them without gratitude, which was its own kind of grace. Gratitude can be a tax men levy on women's bodies, and she would not be taxed more than the business required. The announcements from the king came and went. At some point between the first quickening and the 4th month's nausea, word came that Robert would make a progress south to the Storm Coast, bringing with him banners and jokes and thirst. Stannis said nothing that could be called a complaint. He read the letter twice. He told Cale to open 3 casks of cider and to repair the hinges on the doors to the lesser hall. He told Fell to have the yard at its best, and told the steward to remember that men who drank in the great hall did not need to be fed in the yard. He did not say, "I do not want him here," though men who knew him heard it. Jon had never seen a king and did not imagine that seeing one would change the wall or the weather. When the day came, the king rode in with sunlight affixed to him like coins and a cushion of laughter under his words. He embraced Stannis with the same exuberance he would have used if they had not spent the siege at opposite poles and the years since trading letters like punches. He slapped Renly's shoulder and called him a pretty boy. He kissed Celis' cheek with a flourish that made 2 ladies titter, and Celis set her mouth like a door going closed. He looked at Jon once with a brief interest when the page carried wine, and then looked away, because kings' eyes are pulled by magnets that have nothing to do with boys. But it was later, in a smaller room where the meat and the talk were both easier to digest, that Jon understood what a brother does to a brother's house. Robert sprawled as if chairs existed to suffer, and told Stannis in a voice that had never once required whispering to be heeded, "Give Renly the South Tower. He makes everything prettier." "The South Tower is occupied," Stannis said, "by work." "Work has too many rooms in your house," Robert said, laughing. "You should throw it out in the yard and let it learn to laugh at itself." "This house taught you hunger," Celis said, without warmth. "And I paid it back by making it whole," Robert returned, and there was a wetness under his words that came from beer and from the old wound of a siege a man will never forgive the world for. "Stannis kept your walls with his teeth. I gave him a castle and a wife." "Storm's End would have sufficed," Stannis said, and the words dropped like stones at the base of a cliff that already knew how to handle stones. "You gave me Dragonstone. You too will carve me like boar," Robert said, and waved his hand as if pushing away a gnat. "And yet you both remain mine. Enough. Where is that hunter?" Wild made much of him. They found the man, and Robert made much of him, and the house remembered breathing. Jon watched and held his tongue and learned something new. That a king's visit is a storm of a different sort, and the trick of outlasting it is to keep doing the next thing correctly and never think that proximity to sunlight gives a boy the right to burn. Robert left the hall 2 days later with Davos's onion grin still ghosting the room and a smell of spilled wine that servants would chase for a week. When he was gone, a kind of quiet returned that made men sit up straighter because they had to hold themselves upright again. Celis' belly rounded, then quieted, and then she labored on a day when the wall sang with wind but no rain. The house became a held breath from dawn to dusk. Cresen went up the women's stair at noon carrying a small knife wrapped in silk and came down at dusk with his hair in worse disarray than any man had ever seen it. He nodded once when he passed Stannis. That was all. It was enough. Stannis did not let his knees show what they wanted to do. "A girl," they said, and the word moved like a bird through the hall, landing on branches, taking off. "A girl," Celis said with pride, the way a woman declares the pattern she has been given will do and do well. "A girl," Davos said with the helpless happiness of a father remembering his own. "A girl," Renly said with a joke about cheeks, and then made a face when no one laughed and said only softer, "Good." Because sometimes even Renly learned that you must let a word be what it is and not lace it. She had a noise like a cat shut in a wardrobe. She wrapped her fist around a bit of Jon's finger when he stood with the other pages in a precise row and was presented to this new person who had made the house tilt. She looked at nothing in the way newborns do when their eyes see farther than rooms and men. Stannis stood beside Celis with his hand on the bedpost as if the bed had become a mast and he a sailor who could manage any weather as long as the mast would hold. They named her not in the hall but in the small chamber off the sept where Celis felt the gods could hear more accurately and Stannis felt they were less likely to be insulted into attention. Shireen, said the lady, and it sounded like a song the Florents had taught their girls and the Baratheons had decided to adopt rather than fight. Stannis said the name with careful respect, because he respected names the way he respected sums and stones. Storm's End turned its face a little to make room for this new mouth in its lineage. Jon learned the failing and the miracle at once. That joy makes a house softer and softer things are more easily hurt. Shireen sickened at 6 moons. It began with a fever that had the mean laugh of a man who bets on dice and runs when the table turns. It moved to her skin, and what moved across her cheek did not look like anything that belonged to this house. The maester's knife came back down the stair not wrapped. The sept bell rang not to ask but to tell. Celis prayed in words that tried to be bargains and learned, like all who run at gods in a panic, that bargaining is a game gods play with men as long as there is breath to feed it. Stannis looked at Cresen with a calm so large it barely fit the room. "Tell me what to do," he said. Cresen told him to stand still and then moved like a man who had practiced moving through grief. The cures for grayscale were as reliable as weather. Some men swore by heat, some by cold, some by salt, some by cutting early and hard. Cresen cut where it would not mark the child's smile. He soaked cloths. He set poultices. He sent for powders Davos could fetch in a day if the wind allowed and for if it did not, and Davos went with a speed that could make even wind feel clumsy. He returned with a jar that smelled like rot and an oil that smelled like lemon and 3 tales of a shipmaster's wife who swore by an old woman's witchery and did not care if men called it such if her child lived. In the page's chamber, Jon lay awake with the kind of listening that makes a boy into an instrument. He could hear the house's breathing change in the dark. He could feel the wall lean in. He went to the godswood and stood with his hand on the stunted tree and did not ask anything because he could not bear to owe a god a promise if he was granted what he wanted. He listened until the listening became prayer without words, and then he listened more. In the end, the disease stopped where a man might have placed a hand on its chest and said, "No more." It left what it left. Shireen's cheek and brow kept a map of it in pale gray that would never wash away. Celis told the sept it was a mark of the stranger's disfavor and then told the mirror it was a favor, because the alternative was to imagine that the gods had hated them and her house would not abide that story. Stannis looked at his daughter with an expression that made men in the hall set their eyes elsewhere. It was the look of a man who had found a ledger he could not balance and had decided to love the debt. Cresen sat in his chair the first morning the fever did not ask for more water and let Jon cut bread for him with a knife that had been his for as long as anyone could remember. "You see now why I tell you to light lanterns," he said when Jon served him. "Darkness comes even when the door is closed and the hinge well-oiled. A man who can find the flint is a man who deserves to live in a house. Go, tell Davos I am going to sleep. He will sit the stair. He knows how to sit and let men pass or not pass without making himself the story." Stannis sat the stair more than Davos did. He did it at night when the house wished to believe he slept. He did it with his hands behind his back and his mouth a straight line and his eyes on nothing in particular. Jon passed him once with water and saw the muscle in his jaw work, not with anger, but with the discipline that keeps men from shattering when there is no work to do and work is the only way they know to be whole. After, when Shireen's cries were no longer scissors and her sleep was sleep again, the house breathed out. Stannis called for Ned by Raven with a line so concise it could have been cut with a scribe's best knife. "My child has lived. Come if you can. We must speak of the rope between our houses." Ned came with winter at his back, as he always did even in summer. His presence did not fill the hall with noise. It changed the feel of the stones, the way a new lintel changes how a doorway holds itself. He went up the women's stair to pay the debt of wonder that men owe to infants who have suffered and then sat with Stannis in the small chamber off the hall where the records were kept. Jon stood where a boy stands who knows he has not been invited but will not be sent away if he listens with the modesty of furniture. "The girl will live," Stannis said. "She is marked. The mark offends my lady. It does not offend me." He looked at the shelf where the oldest rolls slept. "You know why I asked you." Ned's face could be an unlit hearth. Say it, he said softly. Men bind houses with things that can be counted, Stannis said. Land, coin, names, but the knot holds best when there is blood in it. I am not speaking of boys held hostage to a lord's displeasure or girls sold to a man's hunger. I am speaking of a plan. If I have a girl and you have a boy, and if both are made to be the better parts of themselves, and if I set my house in such order that a girl can inherit where a boy might take by right. He lifted one hand, palm up. It requires a king's assent, he said plainly, because he would not hide behind words. It requires your consent more than his. It requires the law to be made a road rather than a wall. Ned's breath came slowly in and out as if pulled at by ropes. Jon is a bastard, he said without apology, because shame had no usefulness between these men. Bastards can be legitimated, Stannis said. Kings have done it. If a king will not do it, a different king might. The realm does not end when a stubborn man takes to his bed forever. It changes hands. I cannot plan for a king's whim. I can plan for a house. You have a daughter, Ned said. If I have you right, you intend to place your house in such a way that a daughter inherits. That will anger men. Men are angered by days ending, Stannis said. Men are angered by rules that stop them breaking other rules. They will live. He leaned forward slightly, a small admission of need that would have shocked men who did not know him. If I put my house under the law and name it so, then law-minded men will be made to follow it. If I bind my house to yours with a rope that is properly described in the ledgers and properly blessed by whoever holds the chair at court, then men who want to break it will have to unmake more than my will. They will have to unmake the law to spite me. Some will, but not enough. The spear in his voice stilled. If you would have it, Ned's jaw worked once. You would see a child of your daughter and my son inherit Storm's End. If the law can be made to serve it, Stannis said. If the girl lives, if the boy is made worthy, if you consent, if a king is not a fool, if I still draw breath long enough to set it in order. I do not pretend there are not more ifs than certainties, but a rope is braided from ifs that men bind together until they will hold a cart. It becomes a certainty by being used.
Ned stood.
He did not pace. He put his hand on a roll and then did not take it down. He looked at Jon once, a glance without a message in it, merely a man noting his own boy's presence. The blue ache Ned carried lived in the way his eyes did not settle. It binds the north to the storm, he said at last. It binds a boy I love to a future none of us can promise. I will not give you easy words, but I will not refuse to consider it. He lifted a shoulder. The movement was half sadness, half practicality. If the law can be made to serve it without doing violence to things that matter more than law, if the boy is not made to forget himself to be made into your house's shape. He ran out of ifs and let the silence hold the rest. Stannis nodded once. I will not take your boy and unmake him. I do not intend a toy. If he will not be of use to his own house, he will not be of use to mine, and then none of this need be spoken of. There was no malice in the declaration, only a kind of fairness that could frighten men more than threats. Speak to your gods, he said, with the faintest twist of his mouth at his own phrasing. Or to the tree, speak to your lady. Do not speak to the wrong men. There are always wrong men. Always, Ned said. He looked again at Jon. Write to me of statutes, of what Cresen finds on the question of daughters and female lines holding in the Stormlands. His mouth did a small, tired thing that distantly resembled a smile. Write to me of storms. Do not write to me of feelings. Jon inclined his head, and that was talk enough. When Ned left, he did not look back, and Jon, who had learned something about not looking back, did not despair because of it. Celis listened to the notion with a face that gave nothing away. She let Stannis lay the plan out with the patience of a woman listening to a mason talk about a lintel she knows will stand whether he convinces her or not. When he reached the part where a bastard might be legitimated, her eyebrows lifted a degree. The church will frown, she said softly, making the word church do twice the work. The sept, the hearts of women who talk to one another and talk to men at night until those men think a thing is their idea. "The church has frowned at me before," Stannis said. "It is not your soul I worry for," Celis said, and glanced at the cradle where the thing they both loved cared nothing for their talk. "It is my daughter's. Men will say a bastard steals from her. They will say a bastard stands near her. Do not make me stand in a hall and close my ears to that unless the house needs it more than my ears do." Stannis considered that with the same unflinching honesty he brought to Numbers. "If the king will not have it, we do not speak of it further," he said. "If he will, we will have to. Endure men's mouths either way. Men's mouths do not keep a wall from standing." "My lady," Cresen said later in the library, "I have searched precedents until my eyes would rather see onions than ink. There are instances. They are old and often they are messy, and that is not surprising, because men do not make law earlier than they must. But it is possible for a female line to hold if a lord so sets it and the king consents." Celis sat and placed her hands in her lap, a picture of calm. "And the bastard?" Cresen's mouth twitched. "The law can be made to accept that a man born without the blessing of marriage can be given such a blessing later if a king says so. The law pretends that a king's voice is a kind of altar. This troubles me more as a man than as a maester, but that is because I have notions about what altars are for that men who write laws often do not share. Do not ask a septa to bless what the law cannot," Celis said with quiet steel. "Do not ask me to pretend it will be nothing. It will be everything. It will be a rope," Cresen said, "and ropes burn the hands when they hold. Perhaps this one will hold something that will be good for the realm." "Ropes also drag women under," Celis said and left. The house did not begin to chew on the notion like a bone it would not be done with. Storm's End did not chew. Placed a thing on a shelf and dusted it until someone was ready to take it down. The talk with Ned had not cut anything in stone. It had laid tools out on a bench, and men of a certain temper felt better when there were tools on a bench even if no board had been measured. Shireen lived. The wind stopped carrying her name as if it were a prayer and began to carry it as if it were a fact. Celis loved her the way a mother loves a child she nearly buried, with a watchfulness that is a second labor in itself. Stannis took to holding the child in the evening with an awkwardness that made servants who saw it look away with a respect not far from the one men have for a good blade. He held her as if he feared he would either drop her or break if he did not hold her. She sighed against his chest and drooled on a shirt that could be washed, and he did not flinch. Jon watched the house learn this new geometry and then returned to Numbers. They are kinder than geometry, he thought. Numbers do not mind where you put your hand so long as you put it correctly. He was 12 when Fel handed him a real sword, and the Master-at-Arms's voice did a thing it had done only twice before. It warmed. "You are still a boy," Fel said bluntly. "The steel doesn't care. It will ask you the same questions it asks a man. Stand where you can answer them." Jon stood. He answered. He asked. He learned that a good blow can be less about where you aim and more about where you refuse to look. He learned to make less noise than boys like to make. He learned to put noise away for the moment's noise was useful. In a rush, a shout, a sound in a man's ear that makes the man's blade move where you want it to. Stannis watched him in the yard more often and corrected with fewer words. "You think yourself out of good positions," he said. "Stop that. And another day, you think yourself into bad ones. Stop that. And once, you change direction as if you owed the ground an apology. The ground does not care. It will let you turn." And after a week had passed from that remark, "Good," which was Stannis's way of saying a boy had learned which way to breathe when the wind was against him. Jon took on more duties, and the duties built a framework in him that men could lean on without worrying he would complain. He began to carry the tray to Stannis at the late hour when the Lord ate alone. He stood by the door and learned by watching a man read. He read Stannis's face and discovered that reading a face like that is not about finding what pleases it. Someone will always lie to please themselves, but about learning where the muscles pinch when a number disappoints and where they ease when a sentence is neat. Stannis's relief, when it came like a man who lets a strap drop from one shoulder after a march. It made a boy want to carry more. There were small cases, the kind that look like flies to men who think only of banners. A fisher cut another's lines in the dark to hold the best ground when a school ran. A petty lord's son stole a horse he swore had been promised him, though no one else had heard the promise except the boy and his hunger. A woman kept a second hearth burning, and when she was shown it said it wasn't so, and then it was shown her again and she said yes, it was, because the first hearth had a man in front of it and she did not wish to walk past his palms every night to get the heat. Stannis listened with that attentiveness that angered men because it does not flatter them. He ruled. He took casks of cider and gave back rope and coin and labor in combinations calculated to teach better habits than the ones that had put these people in this room. He asked Jon after what he had learned. He did not say, "What did you feel about it?" Jon answered with the mechanics and the weather. "The fisher thinks night is an excuse," he said. "He will not think so after 4 nights mending lines by lantern, and neither will anyone who thinks to cut next time. The petty lord's son will not forgive you for the horse he had to give back. He will call you a miser to his friends. If you had let him keep the horse, he would have learned that a boy can take a thing if he says he was promised it first. There is no lesson that would have pleased him. The woman's man will not enjoy splitting wood for the second hearth all winter, but his palms will have something to hold that is not a woman's shoulder." Stannis made the quiet noise he made when a boy said something that had a craft in it. "Good," he said. "Now tell me what you did not see." Jon frowned. "I do not know." "The petty lord's son's mother," Stannis said. "Find her. A boy who takes in that house does so with permission. Women often give it, sometimes because they wish to, sometimes because they do not see a way to withhold it without harm. If she has taught him to think himself owed, she needs instruction as well. If she will not accept it from me, she will accept it from my lady." Jon stored that. It was a lesson bigger than casks. Renley came into the library like light does, the kind that insists men open their eyes even if they have been reading comfortable dimness. He leaned on the door jamb. "I've heard my dar brother intends to make a rope of you," he said to Jon, not unkind, but not ignoring the bite that men put into jokes when they worry about the way the world will be arranged around them. "A rope between storms and snow. Men will slip on it and laugh and not notice their necks are snug." Jon did not take offense. He had learned that offense is a tax men pay to themselves when they do not wish to do the work of thinking. "Men slip on ropes less than they slip without them," he said. "I do not wish to be a neck's rope." Renley weighed him. "I don't know if I like that you can say that and stand the way you stand," he said. "It means I cannot jostle you merely to see if you fall down. I like jostling." "You like boys who jostle back," Jon said carefully. "Yes," Renley admitted. "You will jostle like law one day. You will step around men, and then they will be where you wanted them to be before they knew it." "I do not know how to do that," Jon said. "You will," Renley said lightly, and tossed him an apple without warning. Jon caught it without thinking, and Renly's grin was delighted and also a little jealous. "You see? Fell and my brother and that old owl are making you into a man who will not be fun to bully." Davos at the door that afternoon gave Jon a look that carried the sea's kind of counsel. "Do not let yourself be made into a rope that strangles you," he said quietly, having read the day's tide without seeing the page on which it was written. "Be a rope tied to something, but tied by your own hand, if you can manage it." "How do I do that?" Jon asked. "By knowing when to be useful and when not to be," Davos said. "Not doing a useful thing can be the most useful thing a man can do in a house like this. Do not carry every ewer you are handed. You will spill and men will think you clumsy rather than call themselves greedy for having so much water to pour." Jon tried to fit that with what Stannis taught, with what Cresen taught, with what the Godswood did not teach. He put it with the onion and the circle and the wolf and left room on the shelf. When Jon turned 13 he stood, heart a steady thing he could trust, and swore the squire's vow in the yard where the wind had no respect for the dignity of any man's words. Fell's hand on his shoulder was heavy. Stannis's was heavier, because a man's hand is heavier when he keeps care in it. The strong old words were not complicated. They were the sort of words men invent when they want to be certain boys understand them. Obedience, loyalty, silence where required, speech where appropriate, hands that are clean, a blade that is tended, a horse that is fed before the boy who rides it. Jon's voice did not crack on any of them. When he finished, Renley clapped his shoulder too. Even Celis inclined her head to him in a way that admitted he had done something that would make the house's work easier and therefore could not be despised. Squire meant longer hours and fewer questions without answers. Squire meant riding with Stannis along the cliff road when the weather allowed. Jon learned the sound horse hooves make when a man trusts them and the trick of letting your hips do most of the forgiving when the road fails. Stannis instructed as he always did, as if a boy were an adult who needed only a change in vocabulary to be made into one. "Do not ride near the edge because you are brave," he said. "Sometimes the cliff gives way not because a fool rode it but because the cliff had been saving that fall for years. Your bravery does not interest the sea." On one such ride to Cape Wrath, they found a boar torn open by dogs that had lost their nerve at the last minute. Stannis dismounted and studied the tracks the way he studied a bill that did not make sense. He pointed once and said, "If you follow a dog that has just discovered its fear, you will not eat. If you follow a dog that does not know it will be afraid later, you will also not eat. Follow the one who fears and moves anyway." Jon held the boar's ear in his hand and felt the old wrongness and rightness of pigs. That men make use of them and despise them because their faces look like men's faces who have decided to be content with filth. They stayed the night in a keep near the Rath. Lord Selwyn Tarth sent his daughter with a basket of bread and a look that saw through Celis ladies the way rain sees through linen. The girl had shoulders like a gate. She did not look a boy in the face when her father told her to find her lessons. She looked at Jon instead, briefly, and then she looked away with a kind of practical modesty that was not shame, merely good manners exercised by a person whose hands would be better put to sword hilt than embroidery. Jon did not know yet that he would meet 100 men who would underestimate that girl, and that she would make a life out of enduring that underestimation without letting it shrink her. He only noticed that she walked like fell-taught and wondered who in that house counted for law. In the morning he saw it was her father and also the weather. Letters went to Winterfell with more law in them than feeling and more weather than either. Ned's replies came back measured, with observations about snow in the Godswood that still managed to carry the weight of a hand on a boy's head from very far away. He wrote once, "You have become precise," and Jon sat for a long time with that line, unsure whether to be proud or concerned. He wrote back, "I am trying to be useful," and did not say, to whom, because that part moved like the sea and did not always admit of lines a boy could draw and say, "Here is what I can lift." It was near mid-year when Cale Otmore fell ill and Stannis placed the tally book on the table in Jon's hands, as if he were a junior partner in a shop that expected to see winter. "Watch them," Stannis said. "They will think you too young to be offended by attempts to take advantage of your face. Let them think it. Make that stupidity work for you." Jon did. He watched not with suspicion but with attention so honest that men who might have lied found themselves speaking true because lying to that face felt like a discourtesy, as if a boy had offered bread and a man had thrown it away on purpose where a dog could not reach it. He learned that if you ask a man to tell you the truth only once and then look at him as if you expect him to do so, he often will. If he does not, you will know it faster. He walked the yard with the book and saw things you do not see from a bench. How boys jostle when they think a wall has no eyes. How servants develop the habit of carrying two small things when one big thing would have sufficed because it keeps them moving and they will not be told to do another task if they are already moving. He saw that the man who counted pitch was careful and the woman who counted candles was not because she was wicked, but because she hated the smell of tallow and had learned to count poorly to spend less time in the storeroom. He moved her to linens and the change improved both linens and candles. Stannis signed the change and did not call it the boy's idea. He simply did it, which taught Jon something about how men who care more about houses than about credit behave. The rope was not spoken of. It grew, as ropes do, by being twisted in the hands of men while they did other things. Celis watched. Cresen coughed. Davos grinned and made little boats for Shireen from scrap, and she smashed them against the legs of chairs with the studied intensity of a general testing a ram. Renley flirted with the maids and made polite mischief of which only half could be blamed on him. On a night of rare clarity, when the moon thought itself a silver bowl and the sea borrowed a little and let it shine back, Stannis spoke where words would not echo. He was walking the parapet he made his own, and Jon walked half a pace behind, learning to match without aping. "If I do not live," Stannis said, rude to superstition and indifferent to its bite, "I have written what I intend. I have sent it to the king. He will scoff because he is himself. He will not read the words and think about what they mean for a house. He will think about how it makes him feel. But a record exists. If he does not burn it, the next man may. If the next man is a man who thinks beyond his own throat." He glanced. "If he does burn it, it cannot be helped. The work will not be wasted. It will have made you something you were not." Jon swallowed the stone that lived in his throat whenever someone spoke of his life as if it were a line on a plan. "Do you want this?" he asked low, a boy's impertinence corrected by his voice's carefulness. "I want what makes most sense," Stannis said, which in his mouth did not mean he lacked preference. It meant his preference had been argued with and had survived. "If my girl lives, and she will because she has learned early to do what Wind says cannot be done, and if she grows into a person who can count and ride and keep a house in the manner a man does, then she deserves a partner. A good rope holds in both directions." He glanced again. "Do not flatter yourself that it must be you. If you are not made into the thing I require, there will be another. Houses have to be loved and counted in equal measure. A boy who cannot love a house is as useless as one who cannot add." He paused, a charity clothed as severity. "I think you can do both." Jon felt that warmth again. He put it away to carry rather than to look at. "I will try," he said. "Do not try," Stannis snapped, because the word offended him. "Do." They reached the corner of the wall where the wind made a different noise. Below, Shipbreaker Bay met the land and admitted it had been defeated long ago. Stannis's hands moved behind his back. "When I was besieged," he said, and a boy learned to listen differently, as one listens to a stone that suddenly tells you it used to be an animal. "I decided not to die. It was not a dramatic decision. It was not a thing I cried to the sea as if the sea cared. I decided, and then I kept deciding. Every morning I woke with less bread in me than the morning before. Davos brought me onions, and I pretended I had not given him my honor to pay for them. It is like that with houses. You decide to keep them, and then you keep deciding." "Yes," Jon said, because there were only two answers to that, and the other was silence. "Yes." Shireen learned to walk with one fist closed. She had the stubbornness of a storm in her eyes and the quiet of a maester's scriptorium in the way she watched before she dared. She followed Jon sometimes, not because he smiled at her, he was awkward with smiling, but because he did not clap and coo. She liked the way he handed her a roll of ribbon as if she were a woman with hands and not a miracle with none. Celis watched and did not approve of the child's interest in a bastard boy. Stannis watched and approved of anything that made his child steadier on her feet. Cresen watched and hummed a little bit of an old song about a king with too many sons and did not say why that song came to mind. Winter did not come all at once to the Stormlands. It approached like a man who is deciding whether to enter a room. It sent wind first and then sent hunger and only then sent snow, and the snow stayed shy of the walls. Winter elsewhere turned men into stone without their consent. Here it turned men into rope. Jon began to understand how to store wood such that it would not draw too much damp, and how to choose food for men who went out in cold, and how to put his fingers into a horse's coat and feel with more than skin whether it had enough in it to pull a cart in sleet. He learned the trick of going to the kitchen not to ask for more but to ask for different. Stannis sent him twice to houses farther down the coast to see that levees were being maintained, and that men did not think the Storm Lord too far to hear a door unbarred in leisure. Jon talked to petty lords whose sense of their importance made the rooms small. He talked to women who had kept houses while men were out, and he listened, and the listening became its own kind of command. On one of those small errands near Rain House, he came across a net dispute that had sunk 2 coracles and nearly 2 men. Each man had a story, and each story had dignity, and dignity cannot be divided like coin. Jon stood on a muddy spit of land and felt Stannis's carefulness under his tongue. He asked for a knife and made the men cut the net into equal halves with their own hands. He gave the floats to the one whose children were thin, and the weights to the one whose wife was stout and could sell them. "You will both remember," he said when they looked at him as if he had failed to be dramatic. That you cut your livelihood to satisfy your pride. It was a thing Stannis would have said with more edge. It worked anyway. The men stopped shouting and began doing sums in their heads, and work again took command of the day. When he returned, Stannis listened and did not say good. He said, "You cost me floats, as if praise must wear a mask to be tolerated. You cost me weights, fine. And then, after a breath, you cost me less than you would have if you had fed those men's mouths on nothing but anger. Do not do it again unless you must." Jon nodded and filed it with the onion, with the circle, with Davos's comment about not carrying every ewer. Those shelves were getting full. He would need to build more. Ned wrote again, with a sentence that made Jon put his hand on the page. "I have considered what is proposed. It may be that you will be asked to bear a weight heavier than you think you can carry. Do not hope for it nor fear it. Learn to carry." He did not write of Catelyn. He did not write of how men would need to be told a bastard stood beside a lord's daughter and should be allowed to do so. He did not write of kings and their habits. He wrote, "Learn to carry." Jon carried. He carried water and lists, and a blunt blade handled when the iron was too cold to sing. He carried Shireen once, when Celis was taken elsewhere on a matter of kin and the maids were seeing to the ladies' trunks. He had never held a child of such tender bones. He was certain he would break her by wanting not to break her. She reached for his nose and squeezed it as if the face of a squire were a thing a child could make ring like a bell. He made a noise that could, under generous definitions, be called a laugh, and she did it twice more as if she had discovered a law of nature. He was 15 when Stannis began to ask him to sit in the little chamber with the ledgers not as furniture but as a man. "What do you do with a lord who loves his dogs more than his oaths?" Stannis asked him. Jon considered and refused to answer quickly because Stannis hated quick answers that made a man feel clever. "You teach him that oaths feed dogs," he said at last. "You make him swear to feed 3 of the house hounds each night with his own hand, and if the dogs go hungry you cut his rations to make them whole. You trust dogs to teach him because men did not." Stannis's mouth made a small thing that was not a smile and not disdain. "Good. You understand that pride can be used to move a man the way a rope moves a cart. If he does not love his dogs more than his pride, his dogs will be fed anyway. What do you do with a woman who refuses to put her hand into a barrel of eels because she says she is a lady?" Jon asked cautiously. "Put her hand into it," Stannis said. "Or find a task she can do that disgusts her less but serves the house the same. And if she refuses that as well, send her out to learn if there is a house that will take a lady who will not serve. Men think I enjoy such problems. I do not. I enjoy when men do what is required and think nothing of it. Davos says to be careful of doing all that is required because you will not leave room to be kind," Jon said, because it was a day when Stannis's jaw was less bitter than most and because he wanted to test whether his rope could hold 2 ideas at once. "Davos is a man with more room in him," Stannis said. "I have less. That is why houses need more than one man. If I were my brother, I would not need men like Davos because I would charm men into doing things without noticing. I am not my brother. The trick is not to pretend you can be the man you are not. The trick is to gather men who compensate for what you cannot be." He looked at Jon. "The trick is to become a man other men can gather around without despising themselves." Jon looked at his hands and did not despise them. He thought of Winterfell and the way his hands did and did not belong there. He thought of Storm's End where his hands had learned how to be useful and how to be still. He thought of Shireen's fist around his nose and of the onion on his chest and of the circle on that old page. He thought of a rope in the making and of the weight it would be asked to bear. Renley left for court as he grew taller and smoother. Storm's End lost a brightness when he went, and gained a quiet that made some things easier and some things harder. Davos made jokes in the gap and sometimes tripped over them himself. Cresen hummed more, as if music had been the thing that Renly's jokes disguised. Celis wrote to her kin with a tidy hand and more hope than she would show the hall. Shireen learned her letters and learned to accept that ink would stain her fingertips as it stained other men's and did not make her less. Once, A raven came with news that made even Stannis go still for a breath. Jon Arryn, hand of the king, ill in the capital. The news passed like a wind through the house and shook leaves that men had thought secure. Men told stories to themselves when news came that they did not like. Cresen did not tell stories. He said only, "If the man dies, the king will be less well handled," which was the kind of truth that cannot be turned into comfort without lying. Stannis read the line twice. He sent a letter to the capital that had no greeting and no flattery. He said, "I am ready if you require me." It is a letter he would have written whether he had a girl or not, whether a rope was in the making or not. It is a letter a house writes to a realm when it is the sort of house that knows how to carry. The answer from the capital came as if a man had not thought carefully about whom he answered. Robert did not ask his brother to come. Jon Arryn got better. The house put the letter away, because letters cannot be eaten and cannot be used to pitch cracks and therefore should not be kept in the way of useful things. Jon sparred in the yard with a boy from House Morrigan one morning when the wind had decided to sulk rather than attack, and he learned that anger makes some boys stronger for a strike or two and then makes them stupid. He learned to step sideways and let a man argue with the space where you used to be. Fell grunted. "You'll live," he said. "If the man you fight is a fool, you'll live. If he isn't, you'll need luck. So don't choose men who aren't fools to fight." "I won't always choose," Jon said. "No," Fell said. "But you'll sometimes choose whether to start, and starting is where men make their biggest mistakes." The gods would remain stubborn and damp and alive. Jon went there when learning to count had made his head oppress, and standing in the yard had made his shoulders tired in the honest way, and talk of ropes had made his stomach tight. He stood with his hand on the salt-bent trunk. The tree said nothing. He liked that about it. It listened without debt. It taught him patience by making him hold still long enough to find the stillness in himself. It was not a large place. Sometimes he wished for Winterfell's broad shade and the way the air there feels like it makes a boy taller. But this little place did a different thing. It made a boy not wish for anything except breath. On a bitter day when the clouds decided to be petty and sting men's faces with rain so fine it could be mistaken for cold fog, a man from House Wild came to complain about a levy owed in men rather than coin. He said his men were needed on their own walls. He said his coin would buy men who preferred to be paid rather than told. He said a string of things that are not lies until someone asks them what they do to a ledger, and then they become less lovely. Stannis listened and then said, "No," in a voice that made the room feel heavier and steadier at once. "You will send men who will hold a spear where I put it. I will not hold the walls of your house with men who do not know your paths. I will not have you hire soldiers to put in front of you when your enemy comes. I want your men behind you, not behind your coin. You owe me men and wood and fish and duty, and I will take them in that order." The man spluttered. He had been hoping to display his cleverness and learn that cleverness is wanted at Storm's End. "It is, but not that sort," he said. "You ask too much. You ask more than your brother would." "Perhaps," Stannis said. "You may ask him. My brother is a king and believes he can make men better by smiling at them. I am not a king and I cannot spare a smile. Send men." The man sent men, and he sent them with muttering, and Jon watched them in the yard and saw that the muttering burned off under Fell's bark like fog burned off by a noon sun. Men mistrust sternness until it gives them a thing to be stern for. That is a lesson that came to him not in words, but in the way the yard's air changed when the men began to work without performing resentment. That night, Davos sidled into the small chamber where Jon had been sent to ease Kael's scribes with a hand that had grown too old for the newest stiff quills. Davos looked at Jon's paper and whistled once. "That's neat enough to hurt my eyes," he said. "Good. You'll blind a thief with it," Jon said, because it had been with him all day and because the sea puts questions into a boy's head that he has to throw at a man who knows the sea. "Do you think this is good for me? The rope, the talk, the being made to fit a thing." Davos leaned against the doorjamb the way a man leans against an old friend. "No," he said. "I think it might be good for a house. I think it might be good for the realm if the realm learns what a good rope feels like. I think it will be hard for you. I think hard things can be good. I think hard things can be bad. The trick is to stand with men who will tell you when it's the wrong sort of hard. Will you? Jon asked, not as a test, but as one man checks a knot. I will, Davos said. And Stannis will, though he will sound like a wall when he does. And the old owl will, though he will sound like a lullaby. And your father will, though he will sound like a door closing to keep out cold. And the little girl will someday, and she will sound like a bell when it first rings in a new place and surprises itself. Shireen did surprise herself. She learned to read with Cresen's patience and Jon's neatness. She learned to climb the small stairs with Fell's warnings and Renly's laughter in her memory. She learned to look at the gods would not as an offense but as a place where her father went to be quieter than she had thought him able to be, and that made her kinder to the tree. She put her hand on its trunk because she had seen Jon do it, and because imitating a person who keeps his hands clean seemed like a better lesson than any asepta could set upon a slate. Years do not move kindly in any house. They move as they always do, taking men and leaving their tools where they drop them. Cresen's cough became a habit so familiar that people forgot to fear it and then, one autumn, remembered again. It worsened. He sat more. He hummed more. He told jokes to his books that embarrassed them. He did not make a sighing show of dying. He made of it a piece of work that he intended to finish. He drew up lists for Stannis on where the volumes lived and where the copies were kept and which men could be trusted to carry either without making themselves grander for the task. He told Jon where the law had been bent last and where it would likely be bent next. He told Celis where the best herbs for her nerves were kept and asked her to send a maid who would not steal them for a sister. He died as men like him do, in a chair with his face set in the direction of a window, with a little smile that was not sentiment, only the satisfaction of a man who has put a page in order. Jon found him. He stood for a long while with his hand on the old man's shoulder, feeling the stiffness come on, as if setting his palm on a piece of furniture that had always been there and never quite been counted in the room's measure. The house did not wail. Storm's End did not wail. It went quiet the way houses do when they lose something that kept them from rattling in wind. Stannis stood beside the chair with the respect he reserved for only a few things and bowed his head the way a man bows to a wall that saved his life once. Celis cried without apology and without drama because grief should not be asked to apologize for its own use. Davos said, "Ah," as if a man had told him the weather would be clear tomorrow and he had planned for rain and would now unroll his stores. The new Maester wore his chain as if it had surprised him in his sleep, and he had put it on to show the house he could carry its surprise. He was a man of fewer jokes and more inventory. That was fine. Houses need more than one sort of old man in their time, and Storm's End had had a very good sort for a very long time. Jon took the old lessons from the shelves and did not expect new ones to taste the same. He watched the new man and decided to give him time rather than resentment. He grew taller. He did not notice it until Fell made him hold his blade differently and Stannis told him to remeasure a room because his stride had changed the arithmetic. He grew into his shoulders. His voice went where men's voices go when they discover they can be heard from the far end of a hall without being raised. He learned that some women liked him for his face and some did not see him at all because they did not like what his name implied. He learned that this did not mean much unless he let it. He learned a great deal about what it means to be looked at. Different men sponsored that lesson with different coin. Some looked at him and saw a rope, already bitten into men's hands, already binding ice to storm. Some looked and saw a bastard who had been brought into a warm room and wanted him to be grateful for warmth forever. Some looked and saw Stannis' project, and projects make men jealous. Some looked and saw Ned Stark's boy and counted on a kind of fairness. He learned not to flinch when eyes treated him as if he had been a page on which men had written what they wanted to read. In the 3rd year of his squiring there came to the gates a man in yellow from across the narrow sea with a crate wrapped in oilcloth stamped with a dolphin. He had the kind of face that has earned its way by making other men laugh at bargains. He had trinkets and fabrics and a doll for a child with hair as bright as lemon. Celis did not take trinkets from merchants whose names she could not fix in the Stormlands. She sent the man away. Jon had watched the doll with mistrust because he had seen a grayscale scar and knew where plagues had started before. He would think of this small, Unchosen caution later, and be grateful that being made to worry early had saved him a worry later. Robert came once more, years later, rounder and louder and lonelier, as kings sometimes become when the throne they sit on is less comfortable than the chairs in the houses they loved before. He looked at Shireen and did not know how to talk to a child who bore proof of a god's indifference on her skin. He slapped Jon's shoulder and said, "You are a big wolf now," as if a jest could make an arrangement bearable or push a rope into the corner where it would not trip him. Stannis's face when his brother looked away was a thing men in that room did not spend carelessly by describing. When Robert left, the house put away the cups that had been used to toast him and went back to its work. The rope thickened. Ned came again and said nothing in a way that meant permission without confetti. Celis did not break. Stannis wrote again to a king about how a house might be bound and did not send the letter. He kept it and wrote it again and kept that too. He was not a man to make a smooth thing out of something that chafed. He intended to chafe the world until it smoothed to his hand. Jon was 18 when the storm took a corner of the wall, as if it had decided it would have its bite now and not later. Men rushed to hold, and a boy who had been made into a man by work rather than ceremony found himself on a rope that ran along that gap. He did not think of metaphor then. He thought only, tie here, hand there, wait on foot, take the momentum, use it. They held. In the morning after the storm had burned itself out, men looked at the crack with the measuring looks of stonemasons and the half-respect of men who have been permitted to continue living by a wall that could have failed them. Jon stood with his hands on his hips in the manner of his lord and said, "We will set the pitch deeper and give it to the wind that it may leave it alone. We will lay a new seam 3 hands lower because the water found purchase there. We will not pretend the sea is sorry. We will not tell stories about victory. We will fix the crack." Stannis walked to the crack and put his hand on the stone as if greeting a man who had suffered. "Yes," he said, "we will fix the crack. Then we will count the casks. Then we will eat. Then we will sleep. Then we will rise and count again." He did not praise Jon because praise is for feasts. He walked away to fetch men who would do the work. Jon did not require more. He broke a practice blade that winter as if the iron had been waiting for the precise moment in which to make itself honest. Fell shook his head at it as if at a jest that had landed with more noise than craft. "You've learned quickness," Fell said. "Now slow down without stopping. Do it on purpose. Hold yourself in the space between a man's intention and his strike. That's where fights are decided whether men know it or not." Later, in the library, Jon read a treatise on inheritance that Cresen had scrawled in a hand that leaned slightly when he was amused and was stern when he was not. The treatise was older than Jon by a decade but had not grown less sharp. It spoke of daughters and surnames and the ugly word men put in front of children who are inconvenient. It spoke of kings and their rights and men and theirs, and it made no attempt to sweeten behavior with phrases like natural justice. It described ways and means. Jon took notes. He did not write in the margin the one line he wanted to write for himself. "This can be done without unmaking me." He did not know if it could. He did the next thing. Shireen, at 9, asked him whether she would rule if her father died. Men who would have made a jest of that question if it had come from a son could not find a jest when a daughter asked it with innocence that did not deserve to be used as a cutting board. Jon answered with Stannis's talk and Cresen's clarity. "Yes," he said, "if the law is set for it, and if your father writes it properly, and if the king agrees." Her little mouth set in determination as if the word if had not scared her but fed her. "And if the king does not agree?" she pressed. "Then you will still command a house," he said. "And men will command with you, and you will learn how to make them carry the things you cannot carry for yourself." She nodded. She looked at her hands, one with the scar she had never asked to carry. "I can carry a great deal," she said. "Yes," Jon said, and meant the simplicity. She did something entirely ordinary then. She sneezed. It made him laugh in a real way, the laugh that shakes a squire out of solemnity without making him frivolous. She laughed back because laughter is the kind of rope that binds lighter things to men, so they do not have to carry only heavy ones. Years brought other storms. They always do. A hand died in the capital in a spring much talked of for its flowers and less for what was dying behind them. Men in the capital began to move in ways that made the whole realm tilt. Messages went to Dragonstone and did not return as soon as men who counted houses would have liked. Stannis's jaw set. He sent letters with fewer courtesies and more necessities. He called Jon in and said, "If I must go, you will hold here. Fel will hold the yard. The steward will hold the books. The lady will hold her own and yours if you do not fail to stand where you should." He paused, and the pause was a generosity. "If I call you, you will come." "Yes," Jon said, because he had learned the differ. It's between "I will try" and "I will." Ned wrote with a line that lived in Jon's bones as if it had been carved into them there by a knife that knew what it was doing. "If I call you, you will come." He did not think of the meaning behind it. He thought only of how ropes behave when pulled upon by two men standing in different places. He dreamed of Winterfell not as he had known it, but as a house that knew his name when he spoke to it. He dreamed of Storm's End not as a wall and a hum and a salt taste, but as a person whose hand he had learned to hold. He dreamed, once, of a chair of swords he had never seen and woke with the taste of iron in his mouth and an annoyance that the dream had dared come. He washed the taste away with cider that had been counted and went to the yard and bent his knees until the annoyance turned into work and not thought. He was 19 when Stannis handed him a letter with a seal he had never seen used so carefully. "The king has named a new hand," Stannis said. His voice made even the air in a room put down whatever it had been fidgeting with. "Your father." Jon sat. He sat because standing felt performative and because men who do not need to pretend to bravery can sit when sitting makes work better. He looked at the seal. He did not break it. It was not his to break. He felt the rope run through his chest and attach itself to something with more weight than even a Storm Lord's house. "He will go," Jon said. "Of course he will go," Stannis said. "He cannot be himself and refuse. He will go, and that will leave a crack in a wall you do not see until it is there. You will learn to hold where he held at Winterfell, and you will hold where I bid you here, if I bid you, and you will not try to be two men. You will be yourself. If the rope is to be worth anything, it must be made of what it is, not of what men pretend it is." He took a breath that steadied more than his body. "You will not go south unless I call you or your father does. This house will not be left without the men who know which stones hum in which weather. Do not argue. It will waste your day." "I was not going to argue," Jon said, and earned half a look of disbelief. "You will learn to," Stannis said, "when you are lord of something. Perhaps this." He set a finger on the table twice, a habit that looked like impatience and was, in truth, an engineer's tapping. "Do not count yourself my heir unless the law and the king and my will make you so. Do not count yourself out of anything that has not been written. That is the breadth a man must learn to walk in." "I will," Jon said, and this time try would not have been honest. He meant to. He went to the Godswood and put his hand on the tree and said nothing for the longest time. He could almost feel Winterfell there if he stood long enough, not as a place, but as a pressure against his back when he had a heavy thing in his arms. He breathed, and the air tasted of salt and old promises spoken without words. He felt the humility of a boy who has been allowed to be made useful and the pride of a man who had helped hold a rope when a wall cracked. He did not imagine himself great. He imagined himself necessary. The difference is how a house survives when men are stupid. He would have to be stupid sometimes. He hoped he would always stand near people who would tell him when his stupidity began to ask for coin the house could not afford. The day turned. Men ate. Stannis read. Celis prayed and wrote and set rules that made the women's stare run more smoothly. Shireen put her finger under each word she spoke aloud until she no longer needed to. Davos went to the docks and made a joke about a fish with no eyes, and a gull stole the joke and none of the fish. Fel whittled a peg for a boy who had lost one to a practice blade's foolishness. Jon carried a tray. He put it down without spilling. He turned a page. He watched the way Stannis's mouth turned a small, careful fraction when a line balanced. He learned, again, what had made him. The pleasure of a page without a circle on it, and a wall humming not with complaint but with memory. The sea lay down flat for a day as if tired. Wind took the day off. Those are the days when men tell themselves that the storm has forgotten their house. It has not. It has been busy elsewhere, or it has been gathering its wages for later. Jon leaned on the parapet and did not let the peace make him sloppy inside. He allowed it to spread over the top of his thoughts so he could run his fingers in it. He thought about ropes and ledgers and how a man learns to hold one without letting the other slip. He thought about girls with gray on their cheeks who believed they could carry more than men had thought they could, and about women who learned to live with their fear as a knife in the belt rather than a nail in the foot. He thought about being made into a plan and being allowed to be a person inside that plan, and how that was the only way a plan deserved to be made. A gull landed on the wall and looked at him with that galling wisdom gulls carry. The wisdom of creatures that take what they can without poetry. Jon looked back and did not romanticize it. "We'll feed you tomorrow by mistake," he told the bird quietly. "And you will take that as proof that we owe you porridge." The gull did not answer because honesty without language has its own dignity. He turned from the sea and went to the yard because the bell had called, and bells are the best ropes houses know. He picked up the blade that had become his and felt in its weight what he had become. He set his feet in Fell Square. He watched the shoulder, not the blade. He moved not like a wall and not like a feather, but like a man who had learned to put his weight in the right place at the right time. Across the yard, under the low arch that led to the small steps where women went to the little rooms with their work and their talk, Shireen watched him and clapped once softly for herself, and that was enough to make a man who had grown into his wrists grin in a way no one would see. It is safer that way. The grin lived where onion bone and whittled wolf and old circles lived. It was a good shelf. When the rain came back, it came with the familiar malice of a friend who will always speak plain and too loud. Jon welcomed it without calling it welcome. He moved in it and worked in it and slept to it and woke before it when he had to. He stood in a house that had taught him which end of a rope to hold and did not let his mind spend itself on what might be. That was for the gods and for days that had not yet learned their names. His day had a name. It was work. He did it and the house stood. Winter edged in by degrees so small that each one seemed nothing until the sum of them made men pull their cloaks tighter without noticing why. The sea turned the color of old iron and kept it. Wind found its hands again and learned the old tricks. Jon's hours bent to the season the way a reed bends to a stream. Not because it is weak, but because this is what reeds do when they mean to last. He rose in pitch dark and learned the heartbeat of the bells in fog. He walked with Stannis along the parapet and said little and heard much. He made notes for the new Maester, whose neatness had ambition without music, and found ways to let the house miss Cresen without indulging itself in missing him. He took the weight where he could. When Ned's letter came naming the king's decision and saying that a progress would ride north to make the naming into something that candles could be lit for, Jon was in the lower stores with a length of chalk in his hand, marking where damp rode the casks as if it were a lord that had not learned the rules. He read the line twice. "The king names me hand and rides to Winterfell to make a feast of it. I will do the work whether or not he makes the feast. Still, for the house we will light candles." He folded the letter and carried it up to Stannis without running. Running wastes breath. Stannis read, the set of his jaw unchanging as the wall behind him. "He rides to ask what he has decided," he said. "He thinks a thing is not real until he has shouted it in a hall. It is the kind of superstition men develop when the world has given them more than their portion for too long. He asks me to write of statutes that will matter if there is to be a rope." Jon's voice kept the steadiness he had taught it. The small stutter was not fear, merely a boy's mouth making a respectful bow to the size of the ifs that governed his days. "Then write," Stannis said. "Do not try to soften the words to please a man with clean hands. The law prefers iron to wool. If it can be done, show how. If it cannot, write that too." His eyes moved over Jon's face the way they moved over a column of figures that might conceal a lie without meaning to. "Say the thing straight. Your father will respect that. He is not a man who enjoys pulling needles out of cushions." Jon wrote into nights salted with fog. He took Cresen's old treatise down and added to it in margins with a hand that tried to imitate the old man's steadiness and perhaps did not embarrass itself. He wrote in the good square script he had learned at Storm's End of Precedence, when daughters had taken seats with a king's assent and when they had been shouldered aside without one. He wrote the phrasing that had protected a minor from an uncle's grasping wardship, and how a pledge made in a lord's lifetime could be written into the bone of a house if it were stated in the right court and witnessed by the right men. He wrote of legitimations and the sort of kings who liked to make them and the sort who refused, and how a wise man makes his rope with as little king in it as the rope can manage. He wrote as if he were making a plan for a bridge no one would admit wanting to cross, the kind a man builds in good weather and leaves folded because he knows weather. The new Maester, Cresen, a thin fellow with eyes like gray peas and a mouth made for pursed line, read behind him sometimes and hummed not songs but columns of thought. "This could work," Cresen said once, grudging as a scale giving back a coin, "if the king is in a mood to think of houses rather than hunts." "He will not be," Jon said, not without respect. "But kings do not last longer than ropes made properly. A letter survives men who used it to make arguments and died with them still in their throats." Cresen made the small sound educated men make when they do not wish to say that a boy has said a thing that belongs to older mouths. "You will not be beloved at court," he said. "I do not wish to be beloved," Jon answered. "I wish to be understood." "Men will find that a greater burden," Cresen said, half admiring, half resigned. "Very well. Put your notes in a legible packet. A man who finds his way to the truth is more likely to let it stand if the path has nice stones." A raven took the packet north under a sky the color of tin, and men went back to their work because that was what men do when they have put something into the air and cannot bring it back. Jon found himself, on the day the raven left, laying his palm on the godswood's pale trunk and saying nothing at it in particular and everything at once. He felt foolish for a breath, then felt it pass, then felt only the old steadiness that silence gives. Renley returned for a week between feasts at court and made the yard laugh until Fell rolled his eyes and made the laughter work by being mean to it. Renley still carried the knack of making a room's angles look less sharp without moving the walls. He still made trouble like a boy with a stick makes lines in the dust when no one is watching, for his own amusement, not for hunger. He looked taller, not merely in inches but in the sense that his talk had learned its new places in other men's mouths and liked it there. He brought stories like bread from a market. Strange spices, bad jokes, crucial news folded in between. "Your father is to be hanged," Renley said to Jon, leaning with his apple against the window embrasure as if windows existed to be leaned against by men who had discovered that women leaned better. As if the realm did not already think stark and hand were synonyms for boring. Jon did not defend his father with a boy's indignation. He had tested it in solitude and found it wanting as a tool. "Boring keeps ledgers from bleeding," he said. "It has its uses." "Boring also gets men killed quietly," Renley returned, "and there was more thought in it than a jest requires. Keep your eyes on the ravens, wolflet. You will learn a great deal about the South's manners by how soon you are no longer written to." "Wolflet?" Fell repeated in passing, as if tasting sour milk. "He is too tall for diminutives. If you must make schoolyard sport of him, do it in something fitting." Renley grinned and bowed to the old soldier with the gallantry of a man who likes having a sword point anywhere near him only when it belongs to someone who will not use it. "As you say, Sir Hammer." He rode away toward King's Landing with men wearing colors that looked too clean for Storm's End, and the keep returned to its practice of carrying its weight without vanity. Days laid one on top of the other like smooth stones. They held. Shireen learned to read without moving her lips. Celis gave the Sep's bell the habit of regularity. Cresen found in Cresen's desk a drawer whose trick of sticking had defeated him for a month. Inside it were 3 letters that made him sit down and laugh at his own expense, because old men play jokes on the living when they are kind. Davos taught Jon the simple difference between a man who looks at a ship to praise it and one who looks at a ship to see where it will fail. "Be the second sort," Davos said. "Men will hate you for it and then will sail in storms and bless your name without saying it aloud." A south wind brought damp warmth one week and with it a boat that had more than onions in the back. Davos's second boy. Still more hands than wits, but wits grow like hands. Uncovered a bale of soft yellow cloth and a parcel a merchant had meant to keep until a more private moment. In the parcel lay a wig of pale gold hair. Davos turned it in his hand like a man who has found an eel in a barrel of apples. Vanity, he said, but not entirely, as if that were the point. Jon took it to Stannis because it was a thing all wrong at Storm's End, and wrong things lived best when men who kept ropes held them. Stannis did not touch the wig. He leaned over it as if proximity might lie to him. Cersei's shade is more gold, he said, and Jon tried not to admire that a man who did not care for golden women had noticed such a particular. There are 100 reasons a thing like this could be found in a bale that does not like to be seen. He stared a moment more. Your father asked me in his letter to tell him all that can be told about the bastards in this coast towns, whose hair is black and whose eyes are blue. He asked without asking. The man does not ask in a way that allows a man to feel he has been given a task. He gives a man honor by making him do the task as if he had invented it. Jon had not seen that letter. The thought that his father and Stannis had begun to write to one another on matters that reached beyond ropes and weather made a neat place in his chest where a thing could stand. I can collect the names, he said. You can, Stannis agreed, because there was no reason to explain how. You will speak to shipwrights and sailors. They know who leaves what behind. You will ask a midwife or two and not be embarrassed. You will tell them I require it and I will pay for what they do not wish to give free. And you will listen without asking what you are listening for. Your father will call it a habit. I will call it a debt. Why do you ask? Jon asked because Stannis did not mind being asked the thing that would otherwise slap a boy in the back of the head. Because the hand asks, Stannis said. And because I asked him first long ago. Because a seed is not a story until it has been counted. Because a king's line ought not to be a place where die fools anyone. Because if you wish to bind houses with law, you must first bind men to truth. Sometimes the only truth one can weigh is whether hair on a man's head yields to black or to gold. It is an ugly sort of truth. I have never minded ugly things if they do work. Jon went down to the town when the day allowed. He talked to a woman whose hands had delivered half the Stormlands more times than she liked to remember, and who knew fathers by smell and babies by weight. He let a dockhand tell him a joke he had already heard in worse words to earn a name that lay under it like a fish. He bought a child a sweet for the audacity to say the king's hair was as black as the bell ropes and the queen's was like the piss of a mare overdue for oats. He wrote the names down in a neat hand and did not put feathers upon them where no feathers belonged. They were the sort of names that stick to small lives. Tom of the lime kiln, Jane Salt, Maury the bird, a girl whose mother would not let her be named and who had the Baratheon jaw and the eyes of someone who likes the sound of bells. He sent the list north and did not imagine the shape it made there, in a room where men count crimes with flowers on the table. Wind shifted. The day Robert's progress reached Winterfell was told to Storm's End by gulls all at once lifting as if a child had clapped. The yard felt it. Fell barked 3 boys into better stances as if he could make the North's weather obey him. Davos grinned and brought cider, because even a house that disdains ceremony can admit an occasion 1,000 miles off and drink to it if the cider is good. Stannis stood on the wall with his hands behind his back and looked not north but east. He said nothing that he had not said already. The next raven brought news that tasted of iron even before the seal broke. The king would bring Ned south. It said other things, women's names and luxuries that meant nothing to Storm's End, petitions for something to be sent whose usefulness the king had misremembered. But all the room heard was that the rope now ran between the wall and a court where gold moved faster than duty and men forgot what their mouths had promised when wine washed their tongues. Stannis folded the letter very carefully and placed it in the coffer where he kept the few papers that his hands did not trust to shelves. He will take his girls, Stannis said. He will leave a woman who can hold a house, because she has held grudges and that teaches the same muscles, and a boy who wants to hold a sword more than a pen and will learn the pen because his mother tells him to. He turned to Jon. Write to your father that I remind him that a boy must be taught to take counsel not because counsel is right but because it is necessary. And write that if he calls, I will come. And write that if I call you, you will come. John wrote all 3 lines. He did not write the 4th, that he felt himself stretched for the first time into something measured by more than stone and salt. That the stretch did not scare him, that he was learning to be comfortable in the discomfort of being asked by 2 men at once and knowing that obedience requires choosing. He kept that line for the gods would, which kept it for him. He went back to Tarth before winter's heart had bitten all the way down. The road to Evenfall ran in the lee of old stones and newer grudges. Lord Selwyn's hall was a place whose kindness wore armor. The girl was older now and taller, and looked at swords as if they had told her a riddle and she had nearly solved it. She did not fluster when men danced words around her. She listened. When she sparred with the boys in the yard, she took her bruises as if tallying them in a ledger that belonged to herself and no one else. John found that he liked her presence in the way a man likes a second stone under a foot on a slippery path. Not because it is pretty, but because it makes the walking sure. When Stannis spoke to Selwyn about levies and ships and a certain cask that had gone astray here, the Lord of Tarth listened with the forbearance of a man who knows he earns respect better by absorbing a lecture than by parrying it. John watched and learned the difference between men who swallowed their pride because they must and those who swallowed it because they wanted the strength of what it turned into. On his return, the sea decided to hold its breath even as the sky exhaled. It snowed at Storm's End for a day and a night, a thin, astonished sugaring. The yard went quiet in the way places go quiet when the world has changed color. Shireen put out her tongue again, certain of her old trick. Celis allowed herself the smallest, real smile he had ever seen on her. Stannis said, "It will not stick," as prophecy, and he was right in the way he is always right about things that involve the material behavior of the world. John took a handful of it from the crenel and squeezed, felt it melt cold across his knuckles, wondered whether the gods north heard snow prayers differently than salt prayers, decided they did not, put the thought away. The raven that brought the last of winter with it also carried a short letter in a hand that made boys straighten without choosing to. "Come south with your lord if he calls. If he does not, hold. I may require you here or there soon. Teach yourself to ride in mail without thinking about the weight and to speak to men who frighten you as if they did not. Learn the law well enough to teach it to someone who hates it. Your father." John read it twice. He looked at the words that were not there. Dear son, love, proud, and did not wish for them. He liked the words that were there. They were better ropes. Stannis called him that same week to the small chamber where talk that mattered was kept away from walls that might remember and repeat in bad company. Kettrick was there with his ink and his parings of eyebrows. Davos with the smell of the docks wrapped around his clothes and the satisfaction that comes from having good work to show. Fell, who stood even in crowded rooms as if keeping a door for men who could not keep their own. Celis entered last and stood with her back straight and her eyes only on the plan and never on the man she accused planning of in other rooms. "We will be called South," Stannis said, without ornament. "If my brother has any sense, he will call me to sit in a council he does not enjoy, and he will avoid doing so until he is bored of disliking someone else." He looked to Celis. "If I must go, I will leave the house in the charge of my lady. Kettrick will keep the words alive. Fell will keep the yard from growing stupid. Davos will see that men remember our docks are for boats and not for stories. John will keep both books and boys more honest than either wishes to be." "He is not of our blood," Celis said without contempt and without apology. "He is of our holds," Stannis said, and in his mouth the word meant more. "He will do the work. Blood is a story men tell themselves when they wish to ignore that they have tables that need mending." "I will not reject utility," Celis returned. "I will not be made to pretend it is kinship. He can be both useful and bounded. I prefer my ropes tied where I can see the knot." "Then look to the knot," Stannis said. He turned to John. "If I call, you will come. If I do not call, you will not ride chasing glories. We do not chase glories at Storm's End. We fetch them if they are useful." "Yes, my lord," John said, and felt the familiar satisfaction of having been given a task that had the exact weight his shoulders could carry and a little more besides. What came south on the wind after that was letters, and more letters, and the first thin rumors that ride upon letters like fleas. Jon heard that the queen had arrived in the north and ridden away, and that the king had found Winterfell smaller than he remembered and bigger than anyone can measure, and that he laughed and drank and made crude jokes about the Winter Wolf and was forgiven them because men forgive old friends crude jokes even when they should not. He heard that his father accepted. He heard that the South's trees were the wrong kind for a man who had grown tall under God's woods, and that he went anyway because men do not choose their trees. He heard that Bran had fallen and did not die, and that the world above him would not be done with him. He closed his eyes a long moment in the Godswood and said nothing until the silence stopped being a scream and became a blanket put carefully over a sleeping child. He did not tell Stannis of the falling. He did not need to. Another raven came with Stark's neat hand and 2 lines that made the room colder in a way the sea could not. A boy fell from a high place and did not die. I do not know yet whether this is good news or the kind that comes trailing a hidden rope. Stannis set the letter down as if he dared not bend it. A boy who falls and does not die will think himself chosen, Stannis said. Someone will try to choose him again for their own use. You must tell your father not to let other men use his children for stories. He hesitated, then gave the slightest, shortest, most human of snorts. As if I need tell Eddard Stark anything about keeping boys from stories. Tempers at Storm's End turned crabbed when the rain did. The gardeners took to their meager patch with the ferocity of men, who believe a house can be made decent one rosemary bush at a time. Celis clapped the women to their mending with an energy that was a prayer in action. Fell broke 3 of his own rules and then invented 2 new ones to replace them. Kettrick retied the ribbons on his scrolls until they looked like bows on a child's hair, and then threw the ribbons away in disgust at himself. Davos laughed and said it was good the weather had its teeth. Men get lazy when the air decides to play at being kind. Jon walked the edges of rooms and touched only what needed touching, and was surprised at how often his hand was asked for. A little thing happened that winter that mattered more than its size. A woman from the town came up to the hall and asked for the Lord and would not be sent away by a steward with a voice that had never learned to be soft. She had a child in tow whose hair was like black weed in a rock pool and whose eyes were the blue of overcast mornings. The child had a jaw men in the Stormlands recognized. The woman said in a voice that did not shake that she had no wish to be a ladder for anyone but would not be made a rung for a lie either. She said she wanted 3 chickens and enough coin for a winter's wood for telling a truth in the Lord's ear and a protection that wasn't coin for a winter beyond that. She said, steady as wind, that she would prefer to keep her house with the door barred against men who had decided they liked her child's face for all the wrong reasons. Stannis listened to her as if listening were the treat she had been promised. He gave her the coin. He gave her the chickens. He gave her passwords that would keep her from being stopped on nights when men with spears felt their rule more than their sense. When she had gone, he said only to Kettrick, "Write it down. Send the name north." He did not say bastard. He did not say king. He did not say seed. He kept those words for rooms that deserved them. Jon stood straighter because the moment had required nothing of him but attention, and yet that attention felt like a thing done. He looked at Stannis and found that the man had watched him watching. "Good," Stannis said. "You did not rush to be seen as helpful. The house has enough men who hurry to be thanked." Spring nudged winter out of the doorway with the awkwardness of a younger sibling who cannot yet make room without being elbowed. Shireen sprouted while no one was paying attention and suddenly reached the edge of the table with ease that had been effort a season ago. She took to standing on the parapets with Jon and asking questions about Wind as if Wind were a man she could one day order to sit. "You cannot order Wind," Jon told her without condescension. "You can sometimes decide where you'll be standing when it arrives. What if I insist?" She asked, trying on a Baratheon stubbornness as if it were a dress. "Then the Wind will insist as well," he said. "And we will know the stronger temper." She considered, then smiled the kind of private smile that made a girl a person instead of a figure for men's plans. "Very well," she said. "I will not insist. I will be consistent. Father says that sometimes works just as well." She leaned her little elbows on the stone. "Will you leave when Father does?" "If he calls," Jon said, as much promise as truth. "And if mine does, then I will hold," he told her. to teach the distinction that would one day keep men alive. She nodded as if he had given her a lesson better than a sweet. Good. I do not like when everything changes at once. One thing should always be the same, she decided. It makes rooms feel less like boats. They looked over the sea together and did not speak for several minutes. Children are good at silence when they are given it first. News from King's Landing began to arrive like rain blown sideways under a door. Some of it came with seals, and some came with the bend of a seamstress's ear. There was a tourney, said the storm's gossip, with gold thrown about as if gold were fish scales. There were men in green and men in red and men in the black of the hand's plainness who tried to make their plain look finer by earning a good bruise and then having it praised. There was a queen who dined with her kin as if that were unremarkable, and a king who hunted because hunting allows a man to pretend he is still hungry when he is not, and that feels like virtue to men who have forgotten the other kind. There were boys. There were always boys. Princes in silk and sons of blacksmiths. Boys whose hair made older men's hands take on the memory of counting. There were whispers that trailed behind the hand like scraps of torn-out page. Strong seed, wrong seed, no seed of the right sort. Jon read that mold of whisper and felt Stannis's caution stiffen like starch in his own spine. When the raven that carried the first true danger came, its feet were mud-caked. The letter's wax looked as though it had been pressed in a hurry, and the seal not properly cooled before the man had run. Stannis broke it so carefully you would think the contents were liquid. He read and did not sit. He handed it to Jon because there are times a boy must be made a man by looking at a thing without being told how to look. Robert hunts. The hand rides with him. Wolves do not go south. Boar do. If my words seem foolish, forgive me. They are the only words I have. Watch the sea. If it brings what I fear it may, Stannis must be ready. If I call, then come. Your father. The rest of the letter was instruction so technical it read like prayer. A list of men to be trusted, the shape of sums that should be made in a hurry if a hurry is forced upon a house. Send Davos here, send 2 strong ravens there, put Fell and 50 in the yard and do not let them sleep in their boots, but do make them sleep with their boots where they can find them in one reach. There was not a single word in it that said fear. Stannis read over Jon's shoulder to the end and then folded the letter back into itself, and his face did what storms do when they gather strength. It did not move, and yet everything around it began to learn its shape. He looked to Celis, who had entered at the sound of the raven and stood with her head high because a woman has a right to be tall when wind announces itself. We prepare, he said. We do not scurry. Davos, send to your men. Fell, make a list. Kettrick, make another list whose only resemblance to the first is its correctness. Jon, ride to Tarth. Tarth? Jon asked because the instruction surprised him, not because he wished to argue. You will speak to Selwyn of ships and men and a mooring kept empty in case I call for it. Stannis spoke the words as if he had been thinking them longer than Jon had. You will also take a letter he will not like and return with an answer he may not be ready to give. You will do it without allowing yourself to be made into a boy who apologizes for being a rope. Jon took the letter Kettrick pressed upon him, still damp with ink, and sealed while the wax was warm. He saddled a courser who knew his weight and did not mock him for sitting far forward the first mile in his impatience. He rode with a pace that pleased Fell because it wasted neither horse nor hurry. Wind did what wind always does to men who believe it to be a personal offense. It ignored him and then noticed him and then pushed against his shoulder as if to test whether his lessons had stuck. He rode through a night that was not so much dark as undecided and reached evenfall with salt in his hair and quiet over his eyes. Selwyn Tarth asked him in with the courtesy of a man who remembers a boy better than the boy remembers himself. He read Stannis's letter with a jaw that set in increments and then released the grip twice as slowly. He asks for my ships, he said with no heat, only the precise register of a scale. He does not say for war. He does not say for peace. He says for prudence. He knows I cannot refuse prudence without telling my daughter to marry a fool. He asks for your trust, Jon said, and for men who will hold their place on water the way yours hold stone. He says he would not ask if he did not require. Selwyn tapped the seal 2 times with his thumbnail, an echo of Stannis's engineer's tap. It is not the asking I dislike, he said. It is the not asking. He has already decided. He wishes to be praised for allowing me to be the man who eventually agrees with him. He looked mildly amused at his own temper and let it go. Tell him yes from me, because when storms build I do not sit on my piers and pretend they are not clouds. Tell him I send men who do not fall off boats when knives come out. Tell him I send my girl's annoyance also, because she will want to ride to war and I will not send her and she will be angry at me for 3 months and then forgive me when she is older. Her forgiveness is a thing I will collect later. Jon bowed as a man bows when given more than he asked for. Selwyn looked at him without flattery. You stand straighter than you did last we talked, he observed. You are still a boy. Men will expect you to be wrong when you speak because you are a boy. Speak without wincing. They will hear your voice sooner. The way back was louder. Wind had found a song it liked and would not stop singing. Jon rode with his teeth in his jaw and the habit of letting his hips work for his spine. The road made its usual jokes. He returned to Storm's End with salt in every seam and dirt in his mouth, and men in the yard looked at him as if he carried a letter people forgot how to write. He put the reins into a stable boy's hand and went straight to Stannis without sending his breath ahead to make apologies for its noise. Stannis took Selwyn's answer and set it beneath Ned's letter and worried at both with his eyes as men worry a hangnail. Good, he said finally. You held the pace and did not tell the Lord more than he asked. I told him everything he wanted to know, Jon said. That is not the same as everything you think, Stannis returned, and almost allowed himself to approve aloud. Davos came up the postern stair in 3 bounds. Ready, he said. Boats spoken for. Men ready to be paid. Men ready not to be paid and still come if I look at them with enough of your face in mine. Do not use my face on men who deserve better, Stannis said. Use your own. He looked around the small room and set his finger knuckle down on the table once, twice, 3 times. It was more ritual than habit in that moment, and men who knew him did not say so. We will not move until the rope pulls, but we will have our hands on it. It pulled 3 days later, and it pulled hard enough to set ribs aching even before a man had taken hold. Word came like a knife tucked into dirty cloth. A boar and a king and blood that did not heal because it had been meant to end a story. There were other words, fever, drink, old wound, but the important ones were older and shorter. The raven came in at a broken pace and died in the loft from its effort, and men in the yard felt the change in the air as the wall did when the storm turns from song to blows. Stannis did not order mourning. Storm's End did not love Robert as men in the timbered tourney halls did. It had loved him once like weather loves a cliff, by changing him. It remembered him like a scar remembers the blade. Stannis stood and did not bow his head and said, "We move." He did not say where men outside that room could hear it. He said it to Davos and Kettrick and Fell and Jon and Celis pressed her lips together not to keep words in but to keep them from getting their way. Dragonstone, Stannis said, the first time he had named it in that tone in years. Not as a slight, not as a bone thrown to appease a brother's memory of injustice, but as a tool that finally matched the job. Send word to Selwyn. We sail by night. We leave a garrison with a woman who has better discipline than a captain of Sellswords and a boy who can count better than men with twice his whiskers. We leave a bannerman to stand beside them and to be bored. Boredom is safer than glory. We take the records we must. We take what cannot be remade with coin or days. We leave what is heavy and can be remade. Jon. He stopped. He had been about to say what his mouth wanted. Jon. Come. He weighed and put the weight down on the side that displeased him. Hold. Jon felt the pull of 2 ropes and did not pretend it was comfortable. Yes, he said. I will hold. Do not yield to anyone who does not have either my seal or a patience that convinces you he would have had it if time had let him. Do not yield to a turner from the Rainwood whose father calls himself your friend. He is not. Do not yield to a letter with 2 seals and a pretty hand signed by a man who used to laugh in our hall. He is not your lord. Do not open the gates for men who say they come for parley wearing the wrong boots. Look at their boots. The boots will tell you if they came to stand or to run. Sleep in your mail if the weather tells you to, and forget what Kettrick says about rust. Rust is easier to cure than a sword through your lung. Fell nodded as if Stannis had spoken Holy Writ. Good, he said. I will stand where you require and be an inconvenience to anyone who thinks convenience a virtue. He looked at Jon. You will do well if you do not think when thinking is a way to avoid choosing. Choose and then defend the choice with work. Do not defend it with words. Words will come later. Celis took Jon's measure in a look that was not hostile, merely heavy. I will keep the house and the child, she said. Do not bring war to my door unless war must come. If it must, I would rather meet it standing. But do not invite it to dinner because you think yourself hungry. I will not, Jon said, and found that he meant it in a way that made the air steady. Stannis took Shireen into his arms before he went down the Tear to the sea. He did it in a room with only his lady, Davos, and Jon to see, not because he was embarrassed by love, but because love is not to be made into a tool by men in yards. Be obedient to your lady mother, he told the child. Be kind if you can manage it. Be orderly when you cannot. Keep to walls when the wind says to. If a man tells you stories about me, listen politely and then remember that men who tell stories usually admire themselves for knowing the stories and not the men. I will return if rope and wind allow. He put his mouth to her brow, grayscale and all, and did not shudder. He did not kiss her. Kissing is a ceremony he did not care for. He laid his forehead to hers for a breath, and that was a better blessing. Davos shouldered the bags that did not look like bags. Rolls swaddled in sacking, a chest that held iron nails and the sort of ink Kettrick would cry over if it were spilled. A bundle of clothes that looked like anyone's but were counted and counted again. Fell stood in the arch with a hand on the stone, not for drama, only to feel the wall in his palm as men do before trusting it with their absence. Stannis paused beside Jon and set 2 fingers under the boy's chin in the kindest act of compulsion a man like him knows. Making a head lift, making eyes meet, making honesty impossible to wriggle past. If I call, you come, he said. If you call, I might not. Jon did not take offense at the lack of symmetry. Then I will call only when calling will make a thing happen. Good, Stannis said, releasing him. Do not let Renley in. It was half a jest and half a door barred. Jon nodded as if it were all instruction. They sailed at dusk, the boats low and burdened with the ugly necessities that make war possible to endure and peace possible to recall. Storm's End watched its lord go with the stillness of a house that has learned how to do 2 things at once: breathe and hold its breath. Celis stood on the wall with Shireen and did not wave because waving is a waste of a woman's hand when it could be put to better work. Jon stood 2 places behind her where a man stands who is not kin and remains nonetheless the place where the eye returns when duty does. He watched the sails tilt and thought of the letter drawers empty in the little room and the way the wall had hummed a different note that morning, as if the stone had tuned itself for a new song. He touched the crenel with the tips of his fingers and felt the chill go into his skin and sit there, a reminder. He let it stay. Men who have just said goodbye should not be given more talk to do. Men who must hold a house must immediately be given work. Jon went to the yard and made lists. He ordered oil where oil had been forgotten and reminded Kettrick that lists are not supper. He walked the parapet at hours Stannis would have walked it, not because he thought himself a replacement, but because walls like these have been taught over centuries to expect certain footfalls, and a change in that rhythm makes stones uneasy. He set watches with Fell in a manner that would bore boys and please old men. He sent the poor of the outworks a prescribed amount of wood and not a splinter more, and heard, close to dawn, the small breath of gratitude that men give to measured charity. The sort that says we can count on them because they count on us to count. The sea changed its mind 3 times that week and changed it back. Word came from Dragonstone in a hand not Stannis's. A ship list and a curt note about an anchor Stannis would not take unless it had been recast. And from the capital in a hand that had forgotten neatness, as if ink itself were in a hurry to get away from the page. The king was dying and then dead and then buried and then alive again in the mouths of men too frightened to admit they had said the word dead out loud. After, the king was again dead, and the dead man left a boy made king in his place, and the boy had hair that made old men's mouths go dry. There were words about a will and a woman and another boy sent east and the sort of silence that arrives after men stop pretending they do not know what they all know. There were letters from Renley written as if laughing would keep knives dull. "Come south," he wrote, "it will be a pageant." And John read the lines that followed and saw that Renley believed in pageantry the way some men believe in gods. There was a line for Stannis, which John read only because the envelope carried both men's names and because duty sometimes requires impoliteness. "You have always been too late after you were too severe. Join me or find yourself besieged by your own earnestness." John put that last letter away where Celis would not see it until she must. He and Kettrick conferred in whispers over more practical vows. How much tallow to mix with pitch for a light that does not go out when hands are shaking, how to keep the boys from hearing the wrong sort of tales in the town, how to stop household rivalries from becoming wars when men who hold rosters are tempted to make themselves greater than measure allows. He learned the peculiar art of refusing the door to men who thought themselves owed entry. He learned to do it without heat. He learned to do it the way Stannis would, as if the wind had made a decision about which way it would blow, and good men adapted. Renley came to the gate at last, gold and green licking his ride like flames that had been asked to look like silk. He did not come alone. Knights of the Reach rode behind him as if the South had decided to grow flowers and send them walking. John stood on the wall with Fell and Celis and Shireen and watched them approach with the same unastonished gaze he reserved for storms. He would later remember that he had admired the discipline of their line before he admired their arms. Men who keep their lines straight on arrival will sometimes forget to keep them straight when blood makes mud and they cannot see their own boots. He would not forget that line. Renley called up in a voice that carried like a laugh in a cathedral. "Sister, nephew, stern cousin by marriage," he said, because he knew how to make every address sound like a jest that could be forgiven if it offended. "Open your gates and let's have done with the mummery. I come not as a brother alone but as a king." Storm's End listened. It did not answer. Celis turned her face slightly toward John without making a fool's show of it, and he nodded that the script was still the script. Fell said nothing because a good soldier knows that arguments are wasted on walls. Shireen stood between her mother and John and kept her small jaw lined like a lady who has modeled it on a lord she loves. "You come as a rebel," Celis said at last, in a voice that did not require volume to carry. "You come as a man who boasts in gardens while his brother makes sharp his oars. You come with flowers and think stone will blush. You come without a letter that matters." She might have said more, but her husband's house had taught her that cleverness is the way women waste their breath in halls where men count. She did not waste breath. "I come," Renley said, "to claim what you and yours would deny me, though half the realm has already given it. I come to prevent sorrow rather than send it to the outworks where it grows worse teeth. I come," and his eyes moved to John, neat as a needle through good cloth, "to take in this boy who has been given Stannis' face to make it enormous in men's minds. Come down, wolf. You need not hold a wall for a man whose habit of holding walls has already made him a story rather than a king." John did not take the bait. He did not even let it lip his hook. "Storm's End is held," he said in a voice Fell had trained to be audible without shouting, "by its lord's right and his ladies. We have no quarrel with the green. We have no quarrel with the gold. We have a gate." He could feel Celis' approval beside him like a change in pressure, the way air shifts before lightning. "If you wish to speak of quarrels," he added, giving Renley the courtesy of words that could be cut into later, "send up your words on paper." Renley laughed as if a friend had told him a truth he liked despite himself. "You have been taught," he called. "Well, send this down on paper. I will hold the road and the sea both with men who have good manners and better appetites. I will invite you to a feast nightly to see if you get bored of refusing. I will not burn your fields because that would make me a worse king if I am one. I will let the wind keep its bills. When my brother presents himself with his boats and his righteousness, you may tell him I allowed him the courtesy of a siege that does not turn bread as scarce as hearts. It is the best treatment he will receive anywhere, and you would know better than I." The Reach Knights laughed like polished metal struck by the back of a ring. John did not answer. Fell stood with the calm of a man who has held gatehouses while boys wished to make the day more than it was. Celis drew herself up so that a man might see the ghost of Florent in her and remember that foxes are not always hunted. Shireen watched with her chin up because she would need to know how to stand when men asked her to bend, and because her father would be pleased to hear that she had not chewed her lip. Renley set his tents on the road like a garden laid out for a wedding. The Tyrell colors multiplied as flowers do after rain. The smell of fresh bread crept under the wall and made the kitchens curse and double their labors to keep the hall from noticing envy. Davos stood next to John as the sun went and said sotto voce, "Pretty is the first story men tell each other when war comes. Then they invent uglier ones and claim they always believed those instead." "Can we hold?" John asked, because men are permitted one question that sounds like fear when the tents of 1,000 appear at their gate like mushrooms after a wet night. "We can," Davos said. "We have held before when there was less bread and more fear. We have held when it did not look like a festival from the top of the wall. We held when your lord was thinner than a whittled rib. We can hold when the pressure is to laugh, not to starve. It is not such a bad siege, laughter. It distracts men from the job of breaking you, and the wall has a chance to do its work." John took the measure of the siege as a steward measures casks. He had learned that the first thing to count is days. He counted. He counted men's humor and men's tempers and the number of times a certain reachlord brought flowers he had no business bringing to a wall. He counted ravenglass birds that came despite coastal winds not liking them. He counted runs to the well with the careful rope. He counted the new maester's inclination to argue about economy when the cost of salt began to look like the cost of iron. He counted the boys who could go without sleep and knew which of them had to be forced to sleep to preserve them. He counted Celis' control of the women's corridor and the way Shireen's stillness could make that corridor breathe easier. He counted Fell's tendency to station himself on the corner that bore the brunt of wind, as if daring climate to dodge honor. He counted the hours when loneliness would most often try to smuggle itself in. The violet hours before dawn. The first hour after the bell that calls the hall to eat. The late afternoon when light makes men mistake fatigue for drama. He filled those hours with work. Renly's offers came like tide and receded like it too. He offered amnesties writ in pretty hands. He offered place. He offered gentle japes in place of threats, which sometimes bite more. He offered Stannis a place at his table and Jon a place at his heel. He did not offer Shireen anything because he did not yet understand that a girl can be a place that other places are measured to. Celis despised him for that unintentional slight more than for his banners. Jon learned. He felt dimly what it is to be a person and a plan and a gate at once. They had onion soup on the third night as an act of remembrance and an act of practicality. It fed men who had to be fed and fed a story that did not hurt to remember, because it ended in life. Davos lifted his spoon and made a face as if the onion had insulted him, then laughed. "Everything comes around," he said. "Even soup. Eat, boy. You'll be asked to stand in long hallways tomorrow doing nothing that looks like work. That tires a man more than 5 hours carrying stone." On the 5th morning of the siege that was not yet siege, a small disturbance rippled on the far tents, the sort of ripple men who watch for a living learn to read as sentences. The left of Renly's host flexed inward, a shade of movement like a mouth swallowing. Fell tapped the merlin with his knuckles. "He remembers ladders exist," he said. "He will pretend to forget again when lunch is served." Jon had ladders answered above the gate before Fell had finished making the line into a jest. He set men at the angles where wind gnaws. He had pitch warming in a way that did not waste. He told the new maester just enough to make the man think he had decided to be useful. He walked the wall once and set his hand to it, not to draw comfort, not to pretend to speak to a dead king or a living one, but to remember where he was, a place that had taught him the difference between standing and leaning. Renly rode down the line at noon when sun turned the thin grass into points of white. He raised a hand to the wall as if greeting a cousin he wished to needle. Jon stood at Celis' shoulder and did not waste a bow. They faced one another as family faces when the family table has been set wrong and everyone has decided to pretend to be kind for the sake of the old aunt. Words were said that could be written later to make a chronicle. Promises were made that no one believed and were nonetheless recorded. Renly's teeth were very white in the sun, and Jon watched men look and be persuaded by the whiteness and the youth and the certainty that a man who laughs cannot be plotting to take your house apart while you admire him. In the night after that day's pageant, when the tents had gone from parley to shadow and laughter, had been replaced by the careful sounds of men trying to sleep too close to one another, a small boat nosed in under the east spur like a thing that had gotten into the habit of being a secret. Davos's whisper lifted, amused and a bit proud. "There," he said to Jon, pointing at the darker dark. "Now we make stories of our own." "Onions?" Jon asked, unable to help himself. "News," Davos returned, "which sometimes stinks worse." He took the boy by the elbow and moved down a stair built for men who remember getting old even as they run. They received a bundle wrapped in oilcloth and sarcasm. Davos cut it open with a gesture that did not waste finger. Inside lay a letter in Stannis's compact hand. A little water gnawed along one edge but otherwise dry and dangerous. Jon read in the torchlight. The words were hard and right, and if they hurt they did so like a blade set to a bone that must be mended. Renly names himself king. He has no right while I live. The queen's children are not Robert's by blood. You know why. I ride to make men understand what they do not wish to. You will hold. If he comes with flowers, burn their thorns first. He handed it to Celis without the ceremony of fear and without waiting to be asked what it said. She read twice, then once more, then smiled very slightly, a private thing half made of relief and half made of spleen. "Good," she said. "Now we can disdain him openly." She looked at Jon. "We will hold," she said, and in her mouth the vow sounded less like obedience than like a promise she had made to herself a long time ago and had been waiting to redeem. The days after found a rhythm siege engine's envy. Men woke to laughter in the green fields. They went to bed with wind in their teeth. The Reach lords made a show of elegance until it bored them. The Stormlanders within made a show of indifference until it became truth. Jon learned to sleep in 2-hour slices without complaining. He learned to wake with everything in place. Boots, blade, voice, patience. He learned to ask for counsel when it would not make him smaller and refuse it when it would. He learned the particular cruelty of being a rope, that it is pulled by two men who never look at each other. Renly sent up once a little hamper of bread with rosemary on it, and a bottle of sweet wine, and a note in a squire's hand that said, in Renly's words, that he would rather be cousins than enemies. Celis sent it back with no note and the wine poured out, because it would have been wasteful to ruin the bread and foolish to accept the wine. Jon watched and filed the small wisdom of making rejection plain without letting it feel like a dramatic flourish. He spoke to Shireen as men speak to a page when no one else will say true things near them. "You will be told that your uncle is a god of spring," he said. "You will be told your father is a winter that never ends. Neither is true. They are men who want things. They want different things. Your house will survive if you learn what you want and make the wanting part of the work." "What do you want?" she asked, as children do, because their mouths make ropes that pull truth from men without warning. "To do the work," he said. It surprised him to realize he had not said something merely neat. He meant it. To set a thing right and know it. She studied his face, as if deciding whether she liked that answer. "That is not what songs are about," she observed. "No," he said, "but songs are about what people wish they had done, not what they must do." She nodded, perfectly content that the world should be both things at once. Night and day took turns gnawing the same bone. The gates did not open. The flowers did not turn to meat. Men got sunburns when they should have got blood, and discovered sunburns are more painful when pride has been promised them. Jon stood his posts and made little decisions that together became a kind of law. Where to store oil so the smell did not sicken the women. When to require boys to sit and mend their socks even when stepping into holes taught them faster. Whom to praise out loud so that a hall heard it, and whom to praise in private so that a man did not begin to believe praise meant safe. Fell nodded sometimes, an economy of approval that felt like coins placed, never tossed. A raven came one dawn with Stannis' seal broken and resealed over dragon wax. The letter beneath was brief and razor-true. I claim. I have written the truth and sent it where it cannot be unread. I will move when men who pretend not to know it stop pretending. If you can send grain, send it. If not, send trust. Jon read it 3 times. He did not know how to send trust except by not opening the gate. Renly's voice climbed the wall again at noon and found a place to sit on the ledge like a crow. "Send down the boy," he called. "Let him tell me what arithmetic makes a bastard into a rope. I promise to be amused and not offended, which is more than your lord ever promised any man. We will not talk of treason to his cause. We will talk of its inconvenience to mine." Jon leaned into the crenel. "Words about arithmetic mean little to men who count themselves by jokes," he said evenly. "Send a letter if you want to be taken seriously. My lord answers letters. He does not answer laughter." Renly tilted his head. "You are a credit to the North," he said. "You make rudeness feel charitable. Very well, Stark by need. I will send my words in ink. And I will keep the bread warm. When you change your mind, and men do, remember I said I would not make you eat it cold." He did send a letter later in a fine, fussy script that must have belonged to some reach scribe whose satisfaction rested in flourishes where meaning should be. In it, he called himself king more times than law required and Stannis stubborn more times than courtesy allowed. He promised safety to the lady and the child and to Jon if they would acknowledge him. He promised Fel a command and Davos a harbor and Kettrick a place in a library he could get lost in for a year. Celis read and passed it to Jon the way one passes a plate of too sweet pastry to a person who has a better appetite for it. Jon marked it with a small line and sent it to the shelf where Kettrick kept things that might be needed to prove later that a man had been warned. "Will he come?" Shireen asked that night, the straightforward fear in a child's voice never trying to make itself pretty. "With the pretty men? Will he climb?" "Perhaps," Jon said. "But not today, and we are good at today." "Father says that is the only day," she said, content. Wind argued. The wall hummed. In a far room where the door fit imperfectly and let in a thread of salt air as thin as a hair, Celis was writing when Jon stopped to report. She did not look up. "You do not waver," she said, as if remarking on weather. "Good. You do not flatter. Better." She dipped her pen. "Do not make a martyr of yourself to that. There will come a day when you will need to flatter a man because his pride is the last flag between you and hunger. When it comes, flatter. Do not mistake that for weakness. It is work." She glanced up at him then with something close to warmth. "I will not tell you you are dutiful like a son," she said. "It would be untrue, and I do not make untrue things to comfort myself. You are dutiful like a steward who knows his work matters more than his name. That is rare. Keep it." She bent back to her page. "You may go." Jon left with steadier feet than he had entered. He walked the corridor where the smell of onion had lived for 3 days and the smell of pitch for 20 years and the smell of his own sweat for a day. He could not count without making it sentimental. He thought of Winterfell then with a pang that did not accuse him for being where he was. He thought of his father's last letter before the ravens began to carry only storm talk. When a boy holds a house's weight for an hour, he becomes a man before night. He did not know if the transformation was desirable. He did not argue with it. That night a heavy rain came on a wind that had decided to turn and face the wall with a new angle. Renly's camp took on the static hush that heavy weather presses on laughter. There were no ladders at noon the next day. There were new banners up by afternoon, the sort that have the sheen of slender coin behind them. More Tyrells, more hawks, a red hand that made Kettrick purse his mouth because men with red hands and pocketed books are not always the sort to use either rightly. The day after that, Davos brought up from the postern the kind of news that keeps a house from rotting even when the damp finds a way into the joints. A single cart of grain by night and 2 bales of wool that a fisherman's wife had hidden under fish until even a reach night would not have lifted it. "Say thank you," Davos told Jon bluntly. "Not to me. In a kitchen. In a yard. Let it be heard by the right women and the news will more than double the grain's worth. But do not say it with your chest. Say it like you say the number of good casks. Do not make men think that gratitude is all we have to sell. John went to the kitchens and set it to a girl who would carry it to her aunt and to her aunt's husband and then to the man who had once laughed at Davos for bringing onions. The girl smiled because men do not often count women into ledgers, and went off with the news balanced in her hands as if it were a good dish with a burn under it. The siege tightened in ways only men on a wall notice. Fewer jokes at odd hours, more tents moved in small increments that to casual eyes appear to be accidents, more bunching of men at the places where wind screams most. John responded in increments of his own. Extra rope at those corners, not to be used at once. More water set aside closer to the gate. The insistence that boys sleep their proper hours and not make themselves heroes by nodding off on stairs where they'd be more likely to break a neck than earn a song. At sunrise on the 7th day, a banner rode up that did not match the Reach's colors, and yet did not belong to any Stormlands man either. Pale with a golden rose and a smile behind it. Loras Tyrell himself did not ride to the gate. But his courier did, and the message he bore was poetry made knife. Renley summons you to a parley beneath the wall, with 10 men only, no arms, no tricks, no torches. He will bring his own 10. He wishes to make peace with the lady for the sake of spring. The request was impudent and sincere in equal measure, which is the manner of Reachmen when they believe themselves magnanimous. Celis did not answer at once. She looked at John. We cannot accept on his terms without making the wall smaller than it is. Then make a new term, John said. We will speak from the wall. He may stand below with his 10. We will not count which 10 he chooses. He will not count ours either. Celis nodded. Tell him. She looked at Shireen, who had sneaked into the doorway because the child understood instinctively that children must be where the world decides itself if they wish one day to decide it too. You will watch, she said without warmth or apology. You will not speak. You will listen. I will tell your father you did both. Renley came at noon, precisely when men like him are most beautiful. His armor sparkled like champagne. His smile did not need sunshine to carry. 10 men stood with him, all of them carrying faces that had never been taught to be ashamed of what they had been given by wine and long tables. He called up, Lady, in that courteous sing-song that says to a woman, I will call you every name that gives me power until you force me to use the right one. Renley, Celis returned, intentionally without title. Speak. We are working men and have little time to waste. Then I will be brief, he said, and he might even have meant it. You hold a house that cannot feed itself forever. I hold fields that will feed both of us if we stop pretending about winters that do not come all the way south. Your lord sits on an old rock and sulks into it. I stand on good soil and smile at it. My version of rule will make your life easier than his. Yield to me, and your child will be safe. Yield to me, and your boy steward can go north if he wants, and you can have your sternness without the inconvenience of being starved for it. You ask me to yield to appetite, Celis said, but without heat, because saving heat for work saves women from boiling away. You ask me to prefer an easy wrong to a difficult right. You ask me to believe that a man who laughs will not also lie. You ask me to trade a wall for flowers. No. She did not shout the no. She let it drop like a stone down a well so that men would be able to hear how long it took to hit bottom and think about digging. Renley spread his hands. If you claim to stand for law, you will be standing beside a man who is not yet a king and may never be. I have a king's host. He gestured with a sweep like a theatrical curtain. I have the music of the realm. You have a garden and a jest, Celis said. That is all. And you have a rope, Renley returned, glancing at John with just enough malice to be elegant. Do you enjoy being one, boy? Does it make you feel more yourself or less? Stand long enough between two men and you will start to believe yourself the better man for being pulled at once. It is a sweet vanity. If you yield to me, I will give you leave to discover whether you are still a person when no one needs you to be a plan. John did not give him the pleasure of an answer. He let Renly's words hang in the rain like laundry in bad weather and refused to bring them in. He stood. He kept. Renley sighed with feeling. Very well, he said. We will be pretty at your expense for a week and then less pretty. Your women will be less amused by that. Your children will be even less so. Come down while I still have it in me to be gentle. No, Celis said again, gentler than before. But thank you for the offer. My husband returns men's kindness when it is real. Renley bowed as if to a septon whose sermons he could recite in a voice that made them beautiful and not true. Hold your wall, then, he said. We will hold our gardens. Let us see which is more patient. They left the parapet with more work than anyone needed. The wall takes energy from talk. It demands that energy turn back into action, or else it will start humming with men's words, and that is a discord storm's end does not tolerate. John took the offices that Celis' glance gave him. He assigned men to stand on schedule. He assigned men to be bored when boredom would save their lives. He ordered pitch and then rescinded half the order because he had learned that scarcity made men too careful and plenty made them too careless. He sent Shireen to the library when her face started to go blank with an adult's effort to behave. He gave her the safer task of copying down this and ants in a law book to teach patience the way Stannis liked it taught, by doing small, right things until the hand understood what the mind did not. She did it without complaint because it needed doing and because being a rope sometimes means holding small things in place so that large ones can stand. He slept in a cloak in the small room off the gatehouse, as Stannis had taught him. He woke at wrong hours to see if the wrong men were awake. He ate bread that was not yet hard enough to make a man angry about it. He walked the wall with Fel and did not fill silence with words. He went to the godswood once at dawn and set his hand to the thin trunk, and the tree gave back nothing because it had given already everything it could in being alive here at all. He took that as blessing and did not force it to be more. Letters still went out past the siege in little boats, in gulls' mouths, in the careful stomach of a fish caught wrong. Davos smuggled as only a man who does not think of himself as a smuggler can. He brought in answers that mattered. Stannis's shorter lines, colder, sharper, more sure with every day. Ned Stark's absence, like a stone taken from a wall you did not think load-bearing until wind found it. Talk of lions and how loudly they roar when they must make men forget what their eyes plainly see. Kettrick brought news from the Reach camps to the steward's table that had no link to war, which men bellowed in sleep, which women laughed when no one could see them, which nobles used too many candles and made their tents smell like old fat. John learned those details because details keep a siege from making men into blunt instruments that are no longer useful when the gate must be opened. On the 9th day, an arrow came over the wall with no message attached but its own dropped trajectory. John picked it up and felt the fletching between finger and thumb like an old soldier would, then sent it to Fel with no ceremony because men who love weapons for themselves and not for their work should be starved of attention. Fel nodded. Reach work, he said. Pretty. Not too pretty to kill you. Remember that. Renly's laughter did not stop. It grew thinner, as laughter does when men begin to believe their own humor at the expense of stronger things. He held a tourney exercise beyond sight lines, and Storm's End heard hooves and cheering and chose to be unbothered. The business of a keep that knows how to endure is to be unbothered until bothering becomes part of the work. That night, a gull landed on the parapet near John and struck its beak against the stone twice as if sharpening it. John looked at it and remembered the first day he had spoken to a gull without asking for a sign from it. He said, because men are allowed one foolish sentence in a season and survive it, we will hold. The gull cocked its head. It did not demur. He had begun to dream of bridges, not of the Iron Throne. His mind would not allow it the dignity of being a dream, but of spans between things, and of men walking them, and of ropes humming below. He dreamed once of a day when Shireen spoke before a room of men twice her size and their sizes shrank because the words required them to. He dreamed once of walking into a hall he had never been in and being regarded not as an embarrassment but as a tool fitted to a job. He dreamed of Winterfell's steam like breath on a mirror. He dreamed of Durin's old wind kneeling, at last, not because a man forced it but because the work had been worked correctly. He woke from that dream with his jaw unclenched and went to set the watches again because dreams are only reminders, not instructions. On the 10th day, the Reach Knights tried their ladders in earnest, perhaps out of boredom, perhaps because Renly wished to demonstrate he knew what iron felt like when it met stone. The ladders came like a garden being uprooted by excited children, and then came less like that, then like a decision. Pitch answered. Stones answered. Fell's voice answered with a wordless shout that had the good manners to stop when it should. Jon stood where Stannis would have and did not cry orders so much as say the next true thing aloud. Left, water there, not you, hold, not yet, now. He felt his mind slow into crystallized moves like a game he had not played and yet had known all his life. He did not make himself heroic. He made himself correct. Men who try to be heroic knock down their own men with their need to be seen. Ladders fell. A man with golden antlers painted on his helm kept climbing even when everyone else remembered their fear and went down. Jon selected him with a small gesture and watched 2 stones and a spear make numbers out of his bravery. He would remember the face only as a smear of sweat and blood and thistledown. He would remember the way Celis did not flinch when a man went down visible to her. He would remember Shireen's clenched hands and the second she remembered to unclench them on her own. He would remember that the wall did not hum then. It sang. After, Renley's men went back to their food and made more jokes. Because jokes are a hedge that men like to plant when death has come near and not taken the fruit it wanted. Storm's End went back to its bread and its lists and its work. Jon went to the god's wood with pitch under his nails and let the sea wind take the worst of it, the way a woman takes a stain the maid swore would never come out and finds a way to coax it. He did not pray. He stood. The tree stood, and that was more than enough. One more thin letter came under the gate with the onion news in it, and it made all the rooms shift as if men had miscounted the chairs. Your father has been arrested. There were no flourishes in that hand. Kettrick set it down as if it had burned his fingers. Celis closed her eyes for one long breath and opened them the same woman as before. Davos swore once in a sailor's perfect flat pitch. Fell said nothing that needed recording. Jon took the paper up into his pocket because its weight was smaller there, and because men would ask him what he would do, and he must answer with the thing he had always had, hold. He went to the wall and said it aloud to stone. Hold. He sent a letter over the water to a man on a rock shaped like a dragon that said only, the rope holds. He let himself think, for a cut of a moment, of Winterfell's stones and of a wolf in the godswood and of a woman whose eyes could not love him and whose house had nonetheless loved him in the old way that mattered more, by letting him learn what work kept men alive. He slept in his mail. He woke before the gulls and stood on the parapet where Stannis's feet had taught the stones to expect him and felt, as morning came gray and then white and then milk, that he had not been reduced by being a rope. He had been made into something like a beam. The difference is that ropes can be cut and beams must be burned. He did not intend to burn. He intended to do his day and the next. He intended to see it through until a call came and then he would go, and when it did not come he would stay, and when someone tried to rename him for their own good he would speak his own name, which had nothing to do with who begot him and everything to do with the work he did in a house that had taught him a wall's kind of patience. The sea was flat as iron again. It would not last. Nothing does. The wall hummed the way old bones hum in a storm, and a man who has learned to read the note can tell whether it forebodes breaking or only singing. Jon set his hands on the stone and felt that it was the second. He breathed out and did the next thing.